There are moments in history when a single human life, fragile and ordinary in appearance, becomes a vessel for something far greater than itself. Words once spoken ripple through centuries. The poet vanishes, yet the echoes remain, whispering in new tongues and distant hearts. Tonight we journey into one such echo, the life of William Shakespeare, a man whose pen turned thought into eternity. Welcome, wherever you are in the world. Perhaps you are listening in the quiet of a late evening, or as dawn begins to rise. This is Biography Files Docs. Share with us where you are and when. Subscribe if you wish, and join this circle of remembrance as we begin our voyage through time, imagination, and the enduring pulse of words. The story begins, as all stories must, in a small town, a place of markets, bells, and rivers, where a boy once stood at the edge of wonder. The year was 1564. Stratford-upon-Avon was neither city nor village, but something in between, a quiet settlement along the gentle folds of the river Avon, where cobblestone lanes curved past timbered houses and the smell of damp wood mingled with bread from morning ovens. It was spring when William Shakespeare entered the world, the son of John and Mary. His father, a glover and tradesman of some standing, stitched together the modest respectability of Middle England. His mother came from an old farming family, carrying with her the memory of fields and open skies. Together they brought into being a boy who, though ordinary in birth, would one day reshape language itself. To imagine William's first world is to hear the mingling of dialects in Stratford's market, the murmured prayers in the parish church of Holy Trinity, the buzz of flies near the tannery, and the slow, deliberate pace of life before the roar of industry. The boy grew amid rhythm, the rhythm of hammers, of bells, of sermons, and folk songs. Everything spoke if one only listened closely enough. England was restless then, an island on the edge of change. Queen Elizabeth's rule had brought a fragile peace after years of religious turmoil. New worlds were being mapped by sailors who vanished over impossible horizons, and the printing press carried knowledge as swiftly as rumor. To a boy like William, whose eyes seemed always to linger on small details, the gleam of water, the turn of phrase overheard, the world must have appeared vast, uncertain, and full of unspoken possibility. In the Shakespeare household, education was prized as much as labor. John's position as alderman ensured his children access to the king's new school, where Latin ruled every lesson and the classics of Rome whispered through each recitation. But that time had not yet come. For now, William remained a child of Stratford's winding lanes, curious, watchful, and quiet in ways that children who listen too deeply often are. Mary's kitchen was filled with the steady work of care. Herbs hung drying near the hearth, their scents mingling with smoke and yeast. Outside, the Avon shimmered under a pale sun, carrying boats and gossip from neighboring towns. It was a place small enough to know everyone, yet large enough for dreams. Some say the poet's imagination began there, in that mingling of the ordinary and the mysterious, a duck's wake on still water, the laughter of villagers at dusk, the strange beauty of church hymns echoing through cold stone. Others say genius cannot be traced to moments at all, only to the quiet accumulation of feeling. Perhaps it was both. We might picture him, a boy of 6 or 7 standing near the churchyard as bells toll for some neighbor whose name history has forgotten. Death was not distant in those times. The plague had swept through towns only years before his birth and would return again. Life itself was fragile, each season a reminder of both bounty and loss. From such awareness, poets are often born, not from privilege, but from proximity to the mysteries that shape every soul. The child would have learned early the power of words spoken aloud. Market criers, priests, and schoolmasters wielded language like a craft. Even in play, sound mattered. When children of Stratford mimicked tradesmen, argued over marbles, or recited verses from church, they were rehearsing for life upon its grander stage. And somewhere among them, young William listened, always listening. Though we know little of his early years, historians piece together the outlines from parish records, from the trades of his family, from the texture of the town itself. Yet beyond such documents lies another truth, that genius, before it awakens, moves unseen. He was not the firstborn nor the last. He was one among many in a busy household, but there is a kind of solitude that can exist even in the midst of noise, a solitude of observation. Perhaps he wandered along the Avon, skipping stones and watching the ripples distort the sky's reflection. Perhaps he lingered at fairs, watching jugglers and storytellers who wove magic from simple words. In such moments, language might have ceased to be mere communication and become a mirror, a way of holding the world in sound. And yet childhood is not prophecy. There is no record of divine omens, no teacher's note proclaiming brilliance. There is only the slow, unremarkable passage of days. A boy learning letters, helping his father, absorbing the patterns of speech and silence. Still, we may imagine that within him the seed of something timeless had already begun to stir, quietly awaiting its hour. Outside his home, England's seasons turned. Frost gathered on fields, the river froze and thawed, and geese lifted into pale skies. In the evenings, families gathered by firelight to share stories, tales of saints, kings, and spirits. It was through such stories that communities preserved their memory long before paper carried it. For young William, listening was an act of inheritance. Each story entered him as both memory and mystery. And what of faith? In that era, belief was not a matter of comfort, but of survival. The walls between Catholic past and Protestant present were thin and often dangerous. John Shakespeare's own reputation faltered amid suspicions of recusancy, a quiet defiance of the crown's religion. Within such tension, the child must have sensed the fragility of certainty. Perhaps this too shaped the man he would become, one who could write from both faith and doubt, from both reverence and irony. The Avon flowed through all of it, steady and unjudging. Its quiet current mirrored the town's heartbeat, slow, reflective, enduring. And somewhere by that water, the boy would pause, gaze at the ripples, and dream without knowing he was dreaming. As dusk deepens, we leave him there, a small figure at the edge of the river, the light dimming around him, the first stirrings of imagination moving like wind across still water. The bells of Holy Trinity ring softly in the distance, calling him home, or perhaps calling him forward. The sound lingers in the air, unresolved, as though waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The candle burns low upon a wooden table, its flame wavering in the breath of an unseen draught. Beside it lies a boy's hand, ink-stained, moving slowly across a page. The Latin words he copies are centuries old, but they breathe again through his effort, reshaped in the rhythm of his own mind. This is Stratford's grammar school, the King's New School, where boys like William Shakespeare were trained not merely to read and write, but to think in the language of Rome, to reason, to memorize, and to speak with the gravity of men twice their age. The room smells of wax chalk and damp wool. Outside, the bells of Holy Trinity mark the hours, but within these walls time seems slower, stretched by repetition and recitation. The schoolmasters were stern, their canes ever near, their expectations unbending. Each morning began with the Lord's Prayer, then rolled into long hours of Latin grammar, the verses of Virgil, the sharp logic of Seneca, and the histories of Plutarch and Livy. These ancient voices form the foundation of a young mind learning to shape thought through form. Here, Shakespeare absorbed the art of rhetoric, the ordering of persuasion, the dance between sound and meaning. Every metaphor, every cadence that would later move audiences to tears or laughter began as an echo of those early lessons. The discipline was not gentle. It was a world of order and obedience, a place where language was both tool and weapon. Boys were taught to debate, to argue both sides of a case until truth became a performance rather than a possession. Perhaps this, more than any other training, sowed in Shakespeare the seeds of empathy, the ability to inhabit every voice, to see the world through every mind, to find nobility even in the villain and frailty even in the king. The masters would have demanded precision, forcing the boys to repeat lines until every syllable carried weight. Such repetition breeds rhythm, and rhythm breeds memory. It is no wonder, then, that his future verse would flow like breath, disciplined yet alive, each word balanced on the edge of music. But beyond the lessons, beyond the strictures of grammar, there was something else, a secret world forming behind his eyes. As he listened to the masters dissect Cicero or praise the wit of Ovid, perhaps he began to sense that language could do more than instruct or persuade. It could enchant. The myths of transformation, of lovers turned to trees, of gods descending to earth in disguise. These must have filled his imagination with light and shadow alike. The boy who sat quietly at his desk, reciting in the drone of the classroom, may have already felt the pull of story, that deep river of human meaning that runs beneath every sentence ever spoken. Outside the school, Stratford continued its modest pulse. Traders bartered at the market, women drew water from the well, and the Avon flowed past, indifferent to human striving. William's father, John, was climbing the fragile ladder of civic ambition, serving as alderman and bailiff. His success meant respect, but also scrutiny. The Shakespeare name carried both pride and expectation, and a son's education was an investment, a bridge between generations. Perhaps John dreamed of a legal career for his son, or a position in London's growing world of commerce. But the boy himself may have dreamed of other things, less solid, but more luminous. The curriculum was narrow, but its influence was wide. Through Latin, the boys glimpsed the grandeur of empire, the fragility of virtue, the theater of human ambition. They learned how nations rise and fall through speech, through persuasion, through the eloquence of one man standing before many. In those ancient examples, Shakespeare would later find mirrors for his own world, a realm of monarchs and intrigue, of loyalty and betrayal. The school did not teach poetry as we know it. It taught structure. Yet, within that structure, imagination could find its secret passageways. He might have copied a passage from Horace one morning, only to whisper it later in his own tongue, reshaping its music, finding in its rhythm the pulse of English life. The town itself provided its own form of study. Stratford was no great city, but it was a crossroads of tongues. Travelers from London and Wales, farmers from the countryside, merchants from nearby towns. The sounds of their speech, their idioms, their turns of phrase. All of these entered him like notes in an unseen composition. Long before he stepped onto a stage, Shakespeare was listening to the theater of daily life. The market was a chorus, the church, a soliloquy, the home, a small but vivid stage. Language, he must have realized, was alive. It breathed differently in every mouth. There are no records of the young man's face, no diaries or drawings, only his signature, changing shape over time as if even his name refused to settle. But if we close our eyes, we might see him, tall for his age, serious in study but restless in spirit. His thoughts drift between Latin verbs and the murmur of the river outside. He watches how sunlight falls through the window, the way dust dances in its path. He hears a master's voice describing the fall of Troy, and in that instant he feels the nearness of tragedy, of fate, of all that will one day move his pen. In the evenings, when lessons were done, he might have joined friends along the Avon or helped his father in the workshop. There was laughter, there was work, but always there was thought. The boy who memorized Ovid's tales would one day transform them into Venus and Adonis, breathing new life into old myths. The one who studied Plautus and Terence would later borrow their comedies, reshaping them into stories of his own. The grammar school did not make him a poet, but it gave him the keys, the logic, the rhythm, the vocabulary of transformation. The rest would be born from that secret alchemy of observation and longing. There is something haunting about imagining him there, one of many students, his genius invisible to all. How many teachers looked upon him without seeing what would come? How many fellow pupils laughed at his seriousness or forgot his name after leaving school? History is filled with such hidden moments when greatness waits quietly in a crowded room, unnoticed. But perhaps he felt it, an awareness, faint but steady, that words could hold the world. The page, blank and unassuming, was already becoming his companion, his confidant, his mirror. And as the candle gutters in the schoolroom, the boy gathers his papers, his quills, his thoughts. He steps into the night air, cold and damp, his breath visible in the moonlight. The town sleeps, but his mind does not. Somewhere in the darkness, he hears the river whisper again, always the river, its current steady, eternal, reflecting the stars that no human hand can reach. He lingers for a moment, watching them tremble in the water's face, and then turns toward home. The echo of his footsteps fades, leaving only the soft hiss of wind against the eaves, as if the night itself were breathing words he has not yet learned to write. And within that breath lies the beginning of transformation. The morning mist drifts across the Avon, soft and unbroken, veiling the small town in a calm that feels timeless. The boy of Stratford has grown, and the rhythm of childhood has given way to the weight of expectation. He is no longer the quiet student bent over his Latin texts, but a young man whose eyes have begun to search beyond the edges of his familiar world. Yet history, that great collector of evidence, falls strangely silent here. The years between his youth and his first appearance in London are lost to record and rumor alike. Scholars have called them the lost years, a phrase that sounds both mysterious and sorrowful, as though he himself had slipped into shadow. We do not know where he went, what he did, or even who he was during that stretch of unaccounted time. But in absence, imagination thrives, and perhaps that is fitting for a man whose art would later make absence itself a presence. Some say he stayed in Stratford, working alongside his father as the family's fortunes declined. Others picture him as a schoolmaster in some nearby village, teaching Latin to boys who would never know they were learning from the future poet of Hamlet and Lear. A few legends carry him farther afield, a runaway joining a troupe of actors, or a restless soul fleeing scandal after poaching a nobleman's deer. The story of the deer, though likely a myth, carries a certain poetic truth. There is rebellion in it, a spark of defiance against authority, an early echo of the wit that would later mock kings and question law itself. But perhaps all of these tales are shadows cast by a deeper truth, that between the known and the recorded, Shakespeare was simply becoming himself. The England of his youth was changing swiftly. The old certainties of faith were breaking apart under the weight of reform, and the new age of discovery had opened horizons far beyond the Avon. London was growing, pulsing with trade and ambition. The theater, once dismissed as mere diversion, was becoming a force, a mirror in which the nation saw its own reflection. For a young man with words in his blood and restlessness in his bones, such a city would have seemed like destiny. And yet destiny rarely announces itself in clarity. It begins in unease. Perhaps he lingered in Stratford a few years longer, marrying Anne Hathaway, a woman 8 years his senior when he was only 18. She lived in Shottery, a mile or so from the town, in a cottage bordered by orchards and hawthorn hedges. Their marriage, recorded hastily with a special license in November 1582, suggests urgency. Within 6 months, their first child, Susanna, was born. Later came the twins, Hamnet and Judith. The image of Shakespeare as husband and father complicates the myth of the wandering artist. There he was, rooted, responsible, bound by domestic life, while the world beyond called to him with its noise and promise. Did he love her, this woman who shared his home and bore his children? The record gives no answer, but in his later plays, love appears not as simplicity, but as entanglement, full of longing, absence, and return. Perhaps he knew these truths too well. The years that followed are a fog, yet within that fog something must have stirred. Stratford was no place for a mind so wide. The local stages were makeshift, the opportunities few, and his family's fortunes uncertain. The poaching legend, for all its improbability, may hide a metaphor, a young man overstepping bounds, crossing from obedience into risk. And risk, as history has often shown, is the birthplace of art. One can almost see him, walking along the narrow roads southward, a small bundle slung over his shoulder, leaving behind wife and children, uncertain whether he would ever return. He would have passed fields and rivers, towns and silence, each step drawing him closer to London, the restless heart of England's imagination. London was a city of contradictions, mud and gold, plague and poetry, chaos and opportunity. For a newcomer, its noise could overwhelm. Carts grinding over cobblestones, vendors crying their wares, the scent of fish and smoke thick in the air. Yet for someone who had learned to listen, every sound was a story. Somewhere in that swirl, Shakespeare found his path. But before he arrived there, before the globe, before the applause, there were the years we cannot trace. Perhaps he joined traveling players, small companies performing in inns and courtyards, their makeshift stages lit by daylight, their costumes worn thin. If so, he would have learned the pulse of performance, the rhythm of an audience's breath. He would have learned what makes words live when spoken aloud. There's a curious beauty in not knowing. Mystery protects the imagination. We fill the silence with our own dreams, and in doing so, we participate in the making of myth. The poet who would later write that the rest is silence began his journey inside silence itself. These lost years remind us that the path to creation is not always visible. Sometimes genius is born in the invisible labor of survival, in hunger, in anonymity, in wandering thought. Somewhere between Stratford and London, between duty and desire, a transformation occurred. The quiet schoolboy became a man who could see the world as theater. The routines of his provincial life gave way to a new kind of vision, one that saw meaning not in permanence but in change. The world itself became a play, its players unaware of their own lines. This perception, once awakened, could never be undone. Perhaps on some moonlit road, he paused to rest beside a hedgerow. The air smelled of damp earth and distant smoke. In the fields nearby, travelers whispered songs to keep fear away. He listened, as he always did, to the music of speech, to the rhythm of lives moving through uncertainty. And there, in that quiet between destinations, something within him recognized the vastness of language, the power it held to shape memory, to preserve emotion, to turn the fleeting into the eternal. When he finally reached London, whether through chance, will, or necessity, he would be a stranger in a city of strangers. But within him, the foundation had been laid. A grammar school mind sharpened by discipline, a poet's ear trained by listening, and a heart tempered by distance. The silence of those missing years was not emptiness. It was gestation. And so we leave him at the threshold of the city, the mist of the countryside fading behind him, the smoke of London rising before him. He stands still for a moment, neither here nor there, between the known and the unknown, the remembered and the imagined. A distant bell tolls from some unseen church tower, its sound dissolving into the hum of the streets. It is the sound of arrival, though he does not yet know it. The mist closes in again, gentle and unhurried, as though history itself were exhaling. London rises out of the river like a living thing, its breath thick with the scent of coal, sweat, and river silt. The Thames winds through it like a dark artery, carrying not only goods and waste, but the restless dreams of a nation becoming something new. When William Shakespeare arrived, perhaps in his early 20s, the city was already bursting beyond its medieval boundaries. Wooden houses leaned into narrow lanes, their upper stories crowding toward each other like gossiping neighbors. The cries of hawkers, the clang of blacksmiths, the bells of 100 churches, all mingled into a constant murmur that never truly ceased. For a young man from Stratford, it must have been both terrifying and exhilarating. A world of movement, of speech, of possibility. The first thing one learned in London was to listen without losing oneself in the noise. The theaters were not yet the grand wooden circles we imagine, but rough spaces built on the edge of legality, set outside the city walls in Southwark and Shoreditch, where the authorities tolerated what they did not entirely approve. The stage was considered unruly, its influence uncertain, yet the people loved it. From apprentices to nobles, Londoners crowded into open-air playhouses to see tragedies of kings and comedies of rogues. This new world of performance was a crossroad where classes mingled, where the high and the low laughed at the same jest, wept for the same loss. It was, perhaps for the first time, a shared imagination. And into this charged space stepped the young man from Stratford, quiet, observant, with words forming like sparks behind his eyes. No record tells us how he entered that world. Some say he began by holding horses for wealthy patrons outside the playhouses, a practical job for one with quick hands and patience. Others imagine him joining a troupe in need of a player who could read and remember lines. However it began, the theater soon became his true education. Here, the lessons of the grammar school met the raw vitality of the streets. He would have watched actors project their voices across open yards, learning how breath carried meaning, how silence could command attention. The stage was not simply a place for art. It was a mirror held to human life, and he stood before it, seeing for the first time what reflection could do. The actor's world was precarious. Theaters could be shut down by plague or law at any moment. Performances relied on daylight and the goodwill of crowds. Yet there was energy in that fragility, a kind of urgency that shaped everything performed. Words had to be alive. They had to move hearts quickly before the next storm, the next decree, the next silence. Shakespeare, with his sensitivity to rhythm and emotion, must have felt the pulse of it all. To him, language was not only sound, it was flesh, movement, breath. To write was to make the invisible visible, to draw the soul out through the body. We can imagine him standing in the pit one afternoon, watching a scene unfold before him. Perhaps it was a revenge tragedy or a rustic farce, full of shouting and laughter. Around him the crowd pressed close, reacting with shouts and cheers. Above in the gallery, nobles leaned forward, drawn by the same spell. He might have realized in that moment that this communion between actor and audience was sacred in its own way, a ritual of recognition where everyone, highborn or low, saw themselves reflected. For a man who would later write of kings who spoke like commoners and fools who spoke like prophets, this understanding was everything. London also offered something else, anonymity. In Stratford, he had been a son, a husband, a father. Here, he could become whoever he wished. The city did not ask where one came from, it only cared what one could do. The taverns of Bankside were full of poets, dreamers, and opportunists. Men like Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kidd, and Ben Jonson debated over ale and ink, their arguments half philosophy, half survival. It was a dangerous fraternity of words, and Shakespeare, though younger, listened more than he spoke. He learned from them not only the art of verse, but the risks of ambition. Marlowe's daring intellect, so close to fire, would end in violence. Kidd's sharp pen would bring him trouble. In such company, Shakespeare's caution was wisdom disguised as modesty. He began, it seems, as a reviser, a quiet craftsman brought in to polish scenes for established companies. His gift for language was quickly recognized. Lines that once stumbled began to flow. Characters gained depth. Laughter gained bite. Soon, his name, spelled in many ways, appeared on playbills. The transition from actor to playwright was not a leap, but an unfolding. Acting had given him the knowledge of gesture. Writing would give him the power to create those gestures from air. The city was his stage now, its people his cast. But life in London was not all applause. The plague returned often, emptying the streets and silencing the theaters. Fear hung in the air like a damp fog. Shakespeare, surviving through each closure, must have felt the precariousness of all things. Yet it was during such silences that his pen deepened. When the world withdrew, he wrote poetry. Venus and Adonis, The Rape of Lucrece, works that combined sensuality and intellect, born from solitude and observation. The city's noise had taught him vitality. Its sudden stillness taught him introspection. Both would forever coexist in his writing. London, in its contradictions, reflected the man himself, its grandeur and squalor, its wit and cruelty, its faith and doubt, all became the palette of his art. Every street held a story. Every face hinted at tragedy or farce. The inns and taverns of Southwark, where sailors drank beside scholars, must have seemed like endless theater, full of voices to borrow and transform. In these crowds, Shakespeare learned the art of multiplicity, the ability to hold many truths at once. And so he rose, quietly at first, then with certainty. The theaters began to fill for his plays. His lines were spoken by men whose gestures he knew, whose strengths and frailties he had written into existence. Audiences began to recognize something in his words, something larger than entertainment. They heard themselves, their fears and desires, their private laughter and grief, all reflected in the music of his verse. He had turned the language of one nation into the language of the soul. As evening descends, the river glows with the reflection of torches. Somewhere across the water, a play has ended, the applause fading into the night. Shakespeare stands at the edge of the Thames, the air thick with mist, the city murmuring behind him. He listens to the faint sound of oars dipping into the dark current. Perhaps he feels for a moment the immensity of what he has entered. Not fame, not success, but the current of something endless. The city that once frightened him now breathes with his own rhythm. Its pulse and his heartbeat are the same. The mist moves slowly, rising from the river to blur the lights of Southwark. It wraps around him like a memory he has not yet lived. The echo of distant applause fades, replaced by the quiet hiss of water against the banks. He lingers there, half in shadow, as though unsure whether to return to the tavern or to follow the sound of the tide wherever it leads. The decision remains suspended, like a held breath, as the night closes over London's awakening dream. The stage comes alive in the pale light of afternoon, the wooden boards creaking under the weight of movement, the air thick with the mingled scent of sweat, sawdust, and candle smoke. The audience is restless, murmuring as they jostle for place, apprentices and noblemen alike drawn together by the promise of illusion. Somewhere among the players, dressed not as a playwright but as one of them, stands William Shakespeare. His hands adjust a costume, his voice rehearses a line not his own, his eyes search the crowd from behind the veil of performance. Before he was known as a writer, before his name filled title pages and drew courtiers to applause, he was an actor, a man who learned from the inside what it meant to become another soul. And it is here, in this brief, unrecorded interval of his life, that he found the secret rhythm of humanity, the pulse that would later drive his art to such unearthly precision. Acting in Elizabethan England was no gentle pursuit. Players were craftsmen of emotion, laborers of illusion, their work as physical as it was intellectual. They performed in rain and sunlight, before crowds that were not always kind. They had to project every feeling into the open air to make the small seem large and the distant intimate. Shakespeare's body became an instrument long before his words were known. The gestures he would later write for Hamlet or Macbeth were first learned through the exhaustion of performance, through the tension in his own limbs as he spoke someone else's lines. He learned how words breathe when they are spoken, how silence can hold the weight of thought more powerfully than speech. There is something humbling about imagining him there. A young man in borrowed garments, speaking with borrowed authority, learning through failure how truth reveals itself in pretense. The actor's art was ephemeral. No performance was ever the same twice, no audience ever repeated. Each show vanished as quickly as it began, leaving behind only memory, applause, and dust. Yet within that fleetingness lay the essence of what Shakespeare would later immortalize in writing. The understanding that all human life is performance, that we are all actors upon time's stage, playing our parts until the curtain falls. It was not fame that drew him to the theater. It was the intimacy of the stage, the shared breath between actor and listener. When he looked out into the crowd, he saw not strangers, but reflections, faces lit by curiosity, by hunger for story. He felt what it was to hold their attention, to shape their emotion with voice and gesture. In that communion, perhaps he discovered the power that would later move him to write, the desire not simply to be seen, but to make others see. The boy who once listened to the murmur of markets now commanded the silence of hundreds. In that silence, a new identity began to take form. Behind the scenes, life was less poetic. The company of players lived in uncertainty, dependent on the favor of patrons and the whim of city magistrates. Moralists condemned the theater as corrupt, a distraction from prayer and work. Outbreaks of plague could close the playhouses overnight, leaving actors jobless and wandering. Shakespeare learned resilience in this precarious world, the patience of one who knows that fortune turns as swiftly as the wind, and he learned solidarity, the fellowship of those bound by art rather than birth. The troupe was a family of necessity, their loyalty tested by hardship, their joy found in creation itself. Among the actors, Shakespeare's temperament must have stood out. He was steady, not prone to drunken quarrel or reckless display. His memory was sharp, his manner observant, his humor quiet but cutting when used. Some early sources describe him as a good-natured man and honest in his dealings, though others hint that he could hold a grudge beneath that calm. It was this balance, warmth tempered by discernment, that made him both actor and mirror, both participant and chronicler. He could step into a role and at the same time step outside of it, watching from within the very thing he inhabited. Through acting, he came to understand what words could not say. The tilt of a head, the pause before speech, the tremor in a hand. These spoke as deeply as any line of verse. When he later wrote for actors, he wrote as one of them. He knew how the body carries meaning, how timing creates truth. His dialogue breathes because he breathed it first, in costume and sweat and trembling focus before a living crowd. There is no better school for a playwright than the stage itself, no greater teacher than the collective gasp of an audience caught between belief and disbelief. The theater was his church, his university, his battlefield. Within its walls, he learned the grammar of emotion, the syntax of suspense, the theology of laughter and grief. He must have felt at times that the distance between acting and being was perilously thin. After all, when one spends day after day becoming others, who remains beneath the mask? Did he feel the strain of that division, the pull between self and role, between truth and illusion? His later plays would ask those very questions, as though his own experience had turned to philosophy. "We are such stuff as dreams are made on," he would have his Prospero say years later, and perhaps he spoke then of the actor's own fragile identity, shaped from dream and dissolving into air. The audience was his first collaborator. They taught him what moved them, what bored them, what made them laugh or recoil. They were not silent judges, but living participants. From their responses, he learned pacing, tension, irony. He watched how a single word could ripple through 1,000 minds, how laughter could turn to unease in a heartbeat. These lessons, taken from the roar and whisper of the crowd, would one day shape the greatest dramas of the English tongue. The stage was not his escape from reality. It was reality magnified, purified by attention. In the dim evenings after performances, the players would gather in taverns along the river, their laughter spilling into the streets. They drank not only to celebrate, but to forget the uncertainty of their lives. Shakespeare, it seems, often joined them, but drank moderately, listening more than boasting. His eyes, always searching, absorbed the gestures, the cadences, the quarrels and jokes that would later populate his comedies. A man might not recognize himself later on stage, yet his soul would be there, disguised in laughter. And as months passed into years, the actor began to write. It may have started with small additions, a rewritten scene, a speech improved for rhythm or wit. But once his pen touched the page, something irreversible occurred. The man who spoke others' words began to hear his own. The stage that had taught him expression now demanded creation. Acting had been his apprenticeship. Writing would be his revelation. Still, he did not abandon performance. For many years, he would remain both, the one who lived within the play and the one who built its world. It was this dual life, lived in and through illusion, that gave his works their unique heartbeat. As the day ends, the theater empties. The wooden boards cool, the echoes of applause and laughter fade into the night air. Shakespeare lingers behind, alone now, his costume folded over a chair. The torches flicker low, casting long shadows on the walls. He steps onto the empty stage, the silence immense around him. For a moment, he speaks a line from memory, softly, as if to no one. His own voice answers back, doubled by the space, by the echo, by the strange knowledge that he is both speaker and listener, actor and author, shadow and self. He closes his eyes, and the sound dissolves into stillness. Outside, the city hums, indifferent and eternal, while within the darkened playhouse, a single man stands at the center of possibility, ready to write his way into being. Morning mist settles over the rooftops of Southwark, softening the lines of chimneys and timbered walls. In a small chamber above a noisy tavern, a man sits at a rough wooden table, bent over a sheet of paper illuminated by the weak light of dawn. The city is still half asleep, its clatter only beginning to rise, and for a moment there is silence, except for the slow, rhythmic scratch of a quill. The sound is unremarkable, yet within it something is being born, something that will outlive its maker. The man is William Shakespeare, and he is writing, though the word writing feels too pale for what is happening here. He is discovering how thought becomes music, how speech becomes memory, how the invisible can take form through ink. These early plays are not yet perfection, but they are alive. They breathe with the urgency of a man learning to speak in a language that did not yet exist. London's theaters were thriving now, and the appetite for new stories seemed endless. The companies competed fiercely, their reputations rising and falling with each production. A successful play meant full coffers. A failure meant ruin. Shakespeare, who had begun as a reviser of others' scripts, soon found himself trusted to create his own. The first quills, the first words wholly his, were born not from serenity but from pressure. His pen did not move for art's sake alone, but for the living rhythm of a company depending on him. Perhaps that is what gave his early works their vitality. They were written to be spoken, to be felt in the lungs and hearts of actors who would turn them into breath. His first known works, the Henry VI trilogy, were not the polished meditations of a master, but the vivid strokes of a craftsman discovering his reach. In them, England's turbulent past became a stage for exploring ambition, power, and identity. The nation was still haunted by its own wars, and audiences recognized themselves in the chaos of kings and rebels. These plays were filled with clamor, battles, betrayals, and speeches that carried the thunder of youth, yet beneath their noise lay something quieter, a dawning sense that history itself was performance, that power was a mask worn by frightened men. Even in these early experiments, Shakespeare was already tugging at the thread between illusion and truth. He was not alone in this work. The theater in that age was communal, its creation shared among many minds and hands. Collaboration was necessity, not weakness. Playwrights borrowed, revised, and improved each other's lines without shame, for art then was a living organism, not a monument. Shakespeare learned to listen, to adapt, to yield and yet retain his voice. He absorbed the rhythm of Marlowe's thunderous verse, the bite of Jonson's humor, the architecture of Kyd's revenge. But even as he borrowed, he transformed. His words began to move differently, less like stone, more like water, flowing, turning, finding their own path through the world's noise. In those years, the theater was also a reflection of the country's conscience. The reign of Elizabeth was brilliant yet precarious, the fear of rebellion and foreign threat never far from sight. To speak too boldly was to risk censorship or worse, but in the theater, truth could be disguised as story. The stage became a mirror where dangerous ideas could dance in costume. Shakespeare understood this instinctively. In Richard III, he painted tyranny not as a monster's act, but as the slow corruption of a clever mind. In Henry V, he explored the illusion of heroism, revealing courage as both noble and cruel. His plays spoke the language of entertainment, but beneath the laughter and swordplay ran a deeper current, a questioning of what it meant to rule, to obey, to be human in a world ruled by chance. The discipline of writing was relentless. There were deadlines, patrons to appease, actors to satisfy, audiences to win. He must have written quickly, his quill darting like thought itself. Paper was precious, candles costly, time never enough. And yet, through that constraint, something miraculous happened, the birth of fluency. His pen learned to move as his mind moved, without hesitation, without self-consciousness. Words came not from effort, but from listening, to the rhythms of speech, to the cadence of breath, to the quiet voice that seemed to whisper just beyond hearing. The poet's task was not to invent, but to uncover what already existed within the noise of the world. At night, when the tavern below filled with laughter and song, Shakespeare would sometimes pause his writing, lean back and listen. The voices rose and fell, full of mischief and melody, and he recognized in them the raw material of his art. Those voices would soon become Falstaff's wit, Beatrice's defiance, the gravedigger's dark humor, the murmurs of lovers beneath a balcony. The world gave him its sounds freely, and he gave them back transformed. It was not imitation, but translation, the alchemy of experience into art. He was not yet famous, though his name had begun to circulate among players and patrons. What he was gaining was rarer than fame, mastery, the mastery not of others but of himself, of his own mind's immense music. He was learning to balance the personal and the universal, to speak both for himself and for everyone. Each new play was a step towards something larger, though he could not yet see the shape of it. And through it all, he remained a man of two worlds. By day, an actor among actors sweating under costume and sun. By night, a writer lost in silence, shaping chaos into rhythm. The tension between those worlds gave his writing its energy. He knew the physicality of words, their weight when spoken aloud, their fragility when written down. Every phrase had to live twice, once in ink, once in air. He wrote not for eternity, but for tomorrow's performance, yet the very immediacy of that purpose gave his language its pulse of immortality. Sometimes, perhaps, exhaustion overtook him. The candle burned low, the ink thickened, the tavern noise dimmed. He might have looked out the narrow window toward the faint shimmer of the Thames, wondering what it all meant. The endless words, the restless striving, the brief flicker of applause that faded as quickly as it came. Yet something in him refused rest. The words themselves demanded continuation. There was always another line to finish, another voice to shape, another truth to chase through the labyrinth of story. The dawn grows brighter now, the first calls of the city beginning to rise. He sets his quill down, flexes his hand, and reads over what he has written. The page glimmers faintly with wet ink, its letters alive, uncertain, but breathing. He does not know that centuries from now scholars will pore over these same words, that his name will become legend. He only knows the satisfaction of having given form to what once had no form. Outside, the day begins, and with it another rehearsal, another performance. He gathers his papers, tucks them under his arm, and steps out into the waking streets, the echo of the river following him like a heartbeat. The air smells of ash and bread, of smoke and morning light. Somewhere beyond the noise, the sound of a hammer striking wood rings out, a reminder that the world, like the stage, is always under construction. He walks toward it, carrying his words like a secret no one else yet knows. The years moved quietly, though within them his imagination burned with an intensity few could perceive. Between the roar of the theater and the weight of the city's noise, Shakespeare began to turn inward, to a kind of writing that belonged not to the stage, but to the soul. The sonnet was an intimate form, a chamber of echo rather than performance, a private whisper that reached no further than the page. In this space he laid bare his meditations on time, beauty, desire, and loss. If the plays were his dialogue with the world, the sonnets were his dialogue with silence. They spoke to someone unseen, someone at once near and unreachable, and through them he explored the strange geometry of affection, the way love expands and contracts, the way memory distorts its own longing. No other form would so completely reveal the man behind the masks he wore on stage. The sonnet was already an ancient art, its pattern of 14 lines carrying the weight of centuries. But in his hands, it became something new. Italian elegance gave way to English vigor. He made the form breathe with the rhythm of speech, not the polish of ornament. Within its narrow frame, he built vast landscapes of feeling. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Begins with flattery but ends in defiance of death itself. When in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, opens in despair and ascends toward grace. Each poem was a performance without audience, an act of confession disguised as craft. Yet we do not know to whom he confessed, nor whether the love that fills those lines was joy or torment, or both at once. The fair youth, the dark lady, the rival poet. These figures hover at the edge of history, half real, half myth. Scholars have searched for them in portraits and archives, tracing clues through letters and names, Yet perhaps they were never meant to be found. They may be composites of experience, embodiments of moods rather than people. What matters is not their identity, but the truth they provoked in him. Through them, he examined the frailty of beauty, the deceit of passion, the power of memory to sanctify what time destroys. He wrote as one who knew that all love is, in the end, an argument with mortality. To love deeply is to admit that loss is inevitable, and to write of love is to defy that loss through words. In these poems, time becomes the true antagonist. Again and again, he wrestles with its cruelty, its slow erasure of faces, of voices, of promise. Devouring time, blunt thou the lion's paws, he commands, as if language itself could resist decay. And in a sense it could. The very act of writing became his rebellion, each line a gesture of survival. While others sought to preserve their names in monuments of stone, he trusted only in syllables. The sonnets were his architecture, fragile yet enduring, built not from marble, but from breath. But they were also, in a quieter way, a reflection of loneliness. The theater had made him famous, yet fame isolates as surely as obscurity. Among the applause and laughter, he was surrounded but unseen. The sonnets gave him the solitude to speak in his own voice, to touch the shadowed places that drama could only circle. There is weariness in them, the fatigue of one who has watched too much of human frailty to still believe in purity. And yet, within that weariness, there is compassion. His love is not idealized. It is human, flawed, ungovernable. The beloved in his poems is neither saint nor muse, but mortal, capable of betrayal as well as grace. He accepts this paradox, finding beauty in imperfection, fidelity in the act of forgiveness itself. It is tempting to imagine him writing these verses late at night, after the noise of the taverns has faded, his candle burning low. The paper before him glows faintly, and the pen moves without hesitation, as though the words already existed somewhere in the quiet around him, waiting to be gathered. Outside, the river slides unseen through the dark, the same river that had once carried his hopes from Stratford to London. Its current, indifferent and eternal, mirrors the passage of time he tries so desperately to arrest. For a moment, he pauses, dips his pen again into the ink, and writes of the only thing that can stand against time, the persistence of love. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, he writes, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Perhaps he smiled faintly as he set down his quill, feeling the strangeness of the thought that words, so small and fragile, might one day outlast even memory itself. In the light of day, the sonnets would have seemed out of place amid the bustle of rehearsals and the chatter of actors. They were not meant to be spoken from the stage, but to be read in stillness. And yet, they were born of the same impulse, the need to understand what it means to be human. In them, he studied love as he had studied ambition, jealousy, and grief on the stage. He dissected its illusions and its truths with the precision of one who had lived both. The poet and the man could not be separated here. Each line was a heartbeat translated into sound. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to forget how radical this inward turn was. The Elizabethan world prized display, wit, and ornament, yet he dared to speak of love's vulnerability, of the aging of beauty, of the fatigue of desire. He turned emotion into philosophy without stripping it of its pulse. His poems were not declarations but meditations, not arguments but questions. What is love when youth fades? What remains of beauty when time takes its body? Can the act of remembrance itself be a form of love? He never answers these questions fully. He leaves them open, suspended in the air, as if knowing that no answer could satisfy the heart that asks. And perhaps that is why the sonnets endure. They are not solutions but mirrors, not monuments but windows into the shared solitude of being alive. Through them, the man who had spent his life giving voice to others finally gave voice to himself. And in doing so, he discovered that love, like language, is not possession but transformation. To love is to become. To write of love is to grant it eternity. The night deepens. He gathers the pages, binds them loosely, and sets them aside. The candle flickers one last time before surrendering to the dark. From the street below, a distant bell strikes the hour, its sound folding into the hush of the sleeping city. The poet listens, neither content nor sorrowful, only aware. Somewhere beyond that silence, the theater awaits him again, with its noise, its light, its laughter. But for now, he remains still, surrounded by the invisible company of his own words, the ghosts of feeling that refuse to fade. The darkness seems to breathe, and within it the faint whisper of the river carries a promise that the morning will come. The river carries the sound of hammers before the dawn, each strike ringing against the wooden ribs of a rising dream. Along the south bank of the Thames, the players of the Lord Chamberlain's men work shoulder to shoulder with carpenters, lifting beams, fitting planks, binding the skeleton of what will become their own theater. The year is 1599, and the new structure will soon be known as the Globe. It is circular in form, a shape that seems both ancient and prophetic, like a human eye gazing back upon itself. The men labor with laughter and sweat, shouting over the noise, unaware perhaps that they are building not merely a playhouse, but a monument to imagination itself. For Shakespeare, this construction is more than architecture. It is the embodiment of his faith in words, in the shared breath between actor and audience, in the fragile but enduring communion of performance. He walks among them, offering advice, measuring timber, imagining the way sunlight will fall upon the stage. He is no longer merely an actor or a writer now. He is a shareholder, a man with investment in something both material and spiritual. The wood that rises from the earth will carry his voice, and through it the voices of kings and fools, lovers and ghosts. The theater is both his workshop and his cathedral. Its openness is deliberate. There is no roof above the central yard, only the sky itself, vast and indifferent. When rain falls, it will fall upon the audience as well as the players. The boundaries between illusion and reality will always remain porous here. The world outside and the world within will bleed into one another, joined by weather, by time, by human breath. When the Globe opens that summer, London flocks to it as though drawn by an invisible tide. The flag bearing Hercules with the globe upon his shoulders flutters in the wind, a silent promise that here the weight of the world will be lifted through play. Crowds pour across the bridge. Merchants, laborers, noblemen, women in veils, pickpockets, and poets, all seeking that peculiar intoxication that only theater can bring. They stand packed shoulder to shoulder in the pit, the air thick with the scent of ale and rain-soaked wool, while above them the wealthier patrons sit beneath the galleries. The hum of anticipation fills the air like the tuning of an unseen orchestra. And then the trumpet sounds. The curtain stirs. The first words of a new play echo beneath the wooden beams. The Globe is alive. It is impossible to say what Shakespeare felt in that moment, standing backstage, listening to his own lines, spoken aloud for the first time in the theater he helped build. Perhaps pride, though his nature was too private for triumph. More likely a kind of awe, the recognition that something greater than himself had come into being, a circle of humanity bound by story, laughter, and wonder. The Globe was not merely his workplace, it was the image of his philosophy. In its roundness, all divisions collapsed, high and low, sacred and profane, comic and tragic. Everything coexisted within that circle, just as it does within the human heart. The plays he wrote during these years carry the energy of this new home. Julius Caesar opened soon after the theater's birth, its themes of power, loyalty, and betrayal, reflecting the anxieties of an empire at its own height. To stand in that crowd and hear the voice of Brutus tremble between duty and love must have been to feel the pulse of the age itself. The words were ancient in setting, yet immediate in meaning. The globe gave them resonance. Its circular shape turned every speech into an echo, binding the audience into the very logic of fate. The playhouse became a microcosm of the world it reflected, its people assembled in concentric circles, watching themselves played upon the stage. For Shakespeare, the globe was also a kind of refuge. It freed him from dependence on fickle patrons and offered him control over his own art. Within its wooden walls, he could experiment, take risks, invent voices that no courtier would dare speak aloud. It was here that he perfected the balance between laughter and despair, where tragedy learned to dance with comedy, where truth disguised itself as jest. The space demanded versatility. By daylight, the actors performed before the crowd's unblinking eyes. By moonlight, they rehearsed under torch flame, the shadows of their bodies merging with the columns of the stage. Each day was a lesson in transience, each performance a new beginning. He must have loved those afternoons when the light shifted across the open yard, when the line between audience and player seemed to dissolve. He had written once that all the world's a stage, and the globe was that thought made visible. The city itself was the playhouse, and life, with all its unpredictability, entered freely. Sometimes the wind would carry a scent from the river, or the cry of a vendor would interrupt a soliloquy, and the illusion would bend but never break. The theater thrived on such accidents, for they reminded everyone that what they were witnessing was alive. In the evenings, after the performances ended and the audience had drifted away, he would remain behind, walking the empty galleries as twilight gathered. The stage, stripped of costume and sound, seemed like a bare skeleton of something immense. The echoes of laughter and applause hung in the air, invisible but palpable, as if the theater itself remembered every word. He might pause then, gazing upward at the darkening sky through the open roof. The stars appeared faintly, the same stars that had watched over Stratford, over his youth. The distance between then and now felt both infinite and small. He was still that boy by the river, listening, imagining. Only the scale of his stage had changed. In the taverns nearby, his actors celebrated the day's success, their voices drifting through the warm night. He could hear them faintly from the street, but he did not join them. His solitude was not loneliness. It was the quiet necessary for creation. The city was full of noise, and he had learned how to draw silence out of it. He walked along the riverbank, the water glimmering in the moonlight, and thought of how art, like the tide, was endless motion. The globe might stand for a generation or two, but what it contained, the stories, the breath, the laughter, was already immortal. And yet, even as the theater flourished, there was always the shadow of impermanence. Fire was a constant danger, plague an ever-present threat. Perhaps he sensed, even then, that nothing built by human hands could last forever. But that did not matter. The globe was not meant to endure as a monument. It was meant to live and vanish, to be reborn each time a word was spoken. Its destruction, when it came years later, would only prove what he already knew, that the true theater exists not in wood or stone, but in the fleeting communion between a voice and the ears that hear it. Now, as the night deepens and the hammers rest, the globe stands complete. Its walls still smell of sap and sawdust, its stage still bare, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, church bells toll, softly across the river, their sound mingling with the hush of the Thames. Shakespeare stands alone before the darkened structure, gazing up at its curved frame, his face calm, his thoughts unreadable. The wind stirs his cloak. For a long moment he listens to the silence within the circle of timber, a silence filled already with words unwritten, with voices yet unborn. Then he turns away, walking slowly toward the glow of the taverns, the faint light of the city reflecting in his eyes like a promise not yet spoken. Morning light spreads across the wooden boards of the globe, pale and unsteady, as though reluctant to disturb what remains of yesterday's applause. The stage still smells of wax and sweat and sawdust, the residue of the world conjured only hours before, and now dissolved into memory. Here, among the remnants of prop swords and velvet cloaks, William Shakespeare sits quietly with his papers, rereading a scene he has written in the stillness of the dawn. The sound of the city has not yet begun its daily roar, and in this fragile calm he shapes once more the lives of kings. For in these years his mind turns again and again to the problem of power, its splendor, its deceit, its terrible loneliness. His history plays are not chronicles merely, but mirrors held up to the trembling face of authority. Through them, he examines how human frailty hides behind crowns, and how every act of command conceals the fear of silence. Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V. These were not written for the sake of flattery or propaganda, though they bear the imprint of an age that demanded loyalty. Beneath their pageantry, one feels the poet's deeper question. What does it mean to rule another soul? To govern a nation? To wear a crown that burns with its own invisible fire? The monarchy, so remote in its ritual, becomes in his hands the most intimate of prisons. His kings are not distant heroes, but men divided within themselves, their greatness laced with shame. In Richard II, he portrays a ruler undone not by enemies, but by the poetry of his own introspection, a man who can imagine his fall even as he lives it. When Richard surrenders the crown, when he watches his reflection tremble in the polished metal, we sense that Shakespeare is looking through him towards something larger, the fragility of all identity when stripped of the illusions it depends upon. The audiences who crowded the globe did not come for philosophy, yet they felt its presence without knowing it. They came to see battles and coronations, betrayal and blood. They came to cheer the rise of Henry V, the soldier king who embodies the nation's pride. But even in the midst of triumph, Shakespeare slips in the shadow of doubt. His Henry is noble, yes, but he carries the ghosts of those he conquers. His victory speech is laced with melancholy, as though he knows that the glory of one generation is built upon the suffering of another. The crowd might not have heard this sorrow consciously, but it lingered beneath the roar of their applause like a faint undertone in music. In these plays, Shakespeare speaks not as propagandist, but as witness. He understands that power is performance, that a crown is but another kind of costume, and the stage of rule no less fragile than the wooden boards of the globe. The actor king, stepping into light, must believe his illusion so completely that the audience, too, forgets the truth. Yet when the play ends, when the torch is dim and the costume is removed, what remains? The man stripped of pretense, uncertain of who he is, without the gaze of others. In that realization lies tragedy, the same tragedy that binds Hamlet to his ghost and Lear to his storm. The late Elizabethan years were thick with anxiety. The queen was aging, her heir uncertain, the kingdom tense beneath its golden mask of prosperity. The people needed reassurance, yet Shakespeare offered them reflection instead. His histories are not consolations, but questions. They remind England of its cycles, rise and fall, peace and revolt, and suggest that no age escapes the pattern. Perhaps this was his subtlest act of rebellion, to show that kings and commoners share the same pulse, that the boundary between crown and crowd is illusion. The same actor who played a monarch today would tomorrow play a clown. The world, he seemed to say, is both throne and tavern, and each of us plays both parts before we are done. And yet there is tenderness in his portrayal of power, a compassion for those trapped within its glittering cage. In Henry IV, old Falstaff mocks honor with drunken brilliance, while Prince Hal wavers between love and duty. Their scenes together shimmer with laughter that hides the ache of parting, the slow death of youth. When Hal ascends to the throne and turns away from his old friend, the audience feels not triumph, but loss. The laughter that once filled the playhouse fades into silence. Shakespeare knew that to grow into greatness is also to outlive one's joy. Perhaps he felt this truth in his own life, the widening distance between his early exuberance and the gravity that fame and responsibility had brought. His characters live in him as reflections of his own shifting self, the contemplative prince, the cynical fool, the weary monarch. Through them, he explores every corner of the human mind, and in doing so, he blurs the line between author and creation. When Richard II speaks his famous lines, "I wasted time, and now doth time waste me," it is as if Shakespeare himself confesses through the mask of history. The poet who once wrote of love and light now turns toward mortality, not in fear, but in recognition. He has seen that all ambition ends in dust, and yet he continues to write, for the act of creation is its own defiance. Outside the theater, the political world grows more perilous. Spies move through taverns, preachers warn against sedition, and the line between art and treason thins dangerously. The performance of Richard II on the eve of the Essex Rebellion is said to have stirred unrest. The play's depiction of a deposed monarch was too close to England's own fragile reality. Shakespeare escaped punishment, perhaps protected by his tact, perhaps by luck. But he must have felt the tremor of danger beneath his words. The theater, once dismissed as harmless diversion, had proven its power. His mirror did not merely reflect, it revealed. As dusk falls, he sits again within the globe, the empty seats fading into shadow. The torches gutter low, their light trembling along the curve of the galleries. He listens to the silence that follows performance, the purest silence of all, full of what has been spoken and what remains unsaid. On the stage lies a crown, left behind by some careless actor, its gold catching the last flicker of flame. He looks at it for a long time. To anyone else, it is only a prop, a circle of metal and fabric. But to him, it is a question. What weight does power bear, and who among us is not tempted to wear it? He knows that answer too well. The crown, like the pen, is both burden and blessing. To shape the world through words is its own form of rule, though invisible and lonely. Outside, the river glimmers faintly in the moonlight, and across it the bells of London toll the hour. The sound is heavy, solemn, the same rhythm that echoes through his histories, the heartbeat of time itself. He rises, gathers his pages, and leaves the crown where it lies, its gleam fading as the torches die. The stage returns to darkness, and in that darkness the faint scent of smoke and rain remains, like memory refusing to fade. The king has fallen. The poet walks away. Both will rise again tomorrow beneath the same indifferent sky. The following spring carried a softer light, as if the city itself wished to breathe after the long wait of winter and the grim politics that shadowed it. The plague had receded for a time, the theaters reopened, and London seemed to laugh again. In the globe where so many kings had fallen, laughter now rose like birds, startled into the air. Shakespeare turned his mind from the solemn world of crowns to the unruly freedom of fools, lovers, and mistaken identities. His comedies were not born of carelessness, but of wisdom, for he had learned that joy is the most fragile and profound of all human acts. It takes courage to laugh when the world is uncertain, and it takes a philosopher's heart to understand that folly, not knowledge, often reveals the deepest truth. He began to write with a different kind of rhythm, light but intricate, a dance of words and disguises. As You Like It, Twelfth Night, Much Ado About Nothing. These plays shimmer with the warmth of forests and festivals, their scenes filled with music and wit, their characters moving between deception and revelation. Yet beneath their merriment lies the same question that haunted his tragedies. What does it mean to know oneself? In the wilderness of Arden, in the cross-dressed lovers of Illyria, in the endless repartee between Beatrice and Benedick, we glimpse Shakespeare's belief that identity is fluid, that love transforms and confuses, that truth is found not in logic, but in laughter. His comedies are not mere entertainments. They are meditations on transformation, on the way joy itself can be a form of rebirth. The audiences who crowded the globe loved these plays with a fervor that must have astonished even him. They came to forget the city's hardships, to lose themselves in the bright entanglements of wit and disguise. For a few hours, they could believe in a world where error leads not to ruin, but to understanding, where forgiveness arrives not as punishment's shadow, but as light, breaking through confusion. Yet Shakespeare knew how precarious that world was. His laughter always trembles on the edge of sadness, his happy endings balanced delicately against the knowledge of mortality. Even in triumph, there is awareness of the hourglass. The lovers who find each other at last do so under the same sky that will one day darken over them. It is this duality that makes his comedies eternal. They are not escapes from truth, but confrontations with it, disguised in song. He understood that to laugh sincerely is not to forget pain, but to recognize it and to live despite it. When Rosalind teases Orlando, when Viola finds love through deception, when Benedick's wit softens into tenderness, the joy we feel is not simple pleasure, but recognition. The recognition that human connection, however temporary, redeems the solitude of existence. Laughter, in Shakespeare's hands, becomes a sacred act, a brief rebellion against despair. He wrote these plays quickly, their structure as meticulous as their spirit was spontaneous. The energy of the company fed him, the music of their speech, the glint of the crowd's eyes. He wrote as one listening rather than dictating, following the rhythm of conversation, the heartbeat of the people who filled the theater each afternoon. If the tragedies were his night, the comedies were his day, the same world seen in sunlight rather than shadow, the same longing for meaning, the same ache of impermanence, but illuminated now by tenderness. Outside the theater, England continued its uneasy dance between prosperity and fear. The Queen was aging, her court grown cautious, and yet the city glittered with possibility. Shakespeare's fame had grown quietly, not as a noise, but as a presence. He was not yet the myth he would become, but his name was known, his lines quoted by merchants and nobles alike. Still, he avoided the arrogance that fame can breed. He remained the craftsman, disciplined, aware that art is labor before it is glory. Perhaps he found in comedy a reflection of his own philosophy, a belief that life, despite its sorrow, deserved to be embraced in all its contradictions. There are moments in his comedies when laughter pauses and silence blooms, moments when the mask slips and truth stands bare. A clown's jest reveals cruelty. A fool's insight exposes pride. In Twelfth Night, Feste the jester sings of the passing of time. The rain it raineth every day. And in that refrain, light-hearted yet weary, lies the core of Shakespeare's understanding. The play ends. The lovers unite. But the rain continues. Happiness is never permanent, yet it is precious because it is brief. The fool's wisdom lies in accepting both joy and sorrow as parts of the same endless play. Perhaps Shakespeare himself was beginning to feel the weight of that knowledge. He was entering his middle years now, his children growing, his fortune steady, but his restlessness unchanged. The theater had given him everything, and yet it demanded everything in return. Day after day he wrote and performed, his imagination stretched between laughter and grief, but in laughter he found renewal. Writing comedy was an act of healing, a way to remind himself and his audience that the heart, no matter how bruised, could still dance. Sometimes, after a performance, when the crowd had dispersed and the torches flickered low, he would linger in the empty playhouse. The stage, which only hours before had overflowed with music and mirth, now stood silent beneath the open sky. He could almost hear the echo of laughter fading into the night, the memory of joy hovering like incense in the air. It was in that afterglow that he understood the true nature of comedy, not the joke itself, but the moment after laughter, when the world seems briefly lighter and the soul less burdened. That stillness, fleeting and tender, was what he sought to preserve in words. Beyond the river, London glimmered with lamps, its reflection trembling in the dark water. Somewhere, a bell tolled from St. Paul's, marking the passing of another day. Shakespeare stood at the edge of the stage, looking up through the open roof at the constellations scattered across the night. He thought, perhaps, of the lovers and fools he had written, of the countless faces that had smiled beneath those same stars. The laughter of his audiences had become part of the city's breath, inseparable from its pulse. And in that thought, he found quiet satisfaction, not pride, not ambition, but a gentle awareness that in the midst of time's vast indifference, laughter remains one of the few proofs that we have lived. The torchlight flickers, the air cools, and the sound of the river deepens into a steady murmur. He gathers his pages, folds them carefully, and listens one last time to the silence that follows joy. It is a silence full of echoes, of footsteps and music and words that will outlast the bodies that spoke them. The stage is empty, but the world feels newly alive, as if it too were waiting for its next line. The laughter fades, and in its wake comes the stillness of reckoning. The same hand that wrote of mirth and reunion now turns toward shadow. It is not that Shakespeare abandoned joy. Rather, he descended beneath it, into the subterranean chambers of the human heart, where joy and sorrow share the same root. Around the turn of the century, his imagination darkened, the language of his plays deepened, and what emerged from that change were the tragedies, works that seemed less written than wrestled into being. They were not spectacles of doom, but meditations on consciousness itself. In them, he asked what happens when thought becomes too vast for comfort, when the mind, straining to understand its world, collapses under the weight of its own clarity. In Hamlet, he gave that question its perfect voice. The Danish prince, poised between action and paralysis, carries within him the torment of all who think too deeply. His world is corrupt, his purpose uncertain, and his intellect, meant to guide him, becomes his trap. When he says, "to be or not to be," he does not seek philosophy but relief from the burden of awareness. Shakespeare understood that intelligence, unanchored by faith or love, turns cruelly upon itself. Through Hamlet, he turned the stage into a mirror of the soul, showing how thought can destroy the body that bears it. The play's silences are as powerful as its words, the pauses between sentences filled with the sound of a mind breaking against its own boundaries. To watch Hamlet is to see reflection devour reality until only doubt remains. From Hamlet's introspection, he moved to Othello's trust, that most painful form of blindness. If Hamlet is tragedy born of too much thought, Othello is tragedy born of too much belief. The general's love is vast, innocent, absolute, and therefore doomed. Iago's poison works not because Othello is weak, but because he is human. The whisper of jealousy is enough to unravel even the strongest heart. In this play, Shakespeare turns love itself into a kind of madness, a force both pure and destructive. The language burns with intensity, each word pulsing with the terror of losing what one holds most dear. And yet, as always, the poet's compassion underlies the horror. He does not judge his characters. He allows them to fall with dignity, as though each were a fragment of his own divided nature. Then came King Lear, that storm of language and sorrow, where the borders between reason and despair vanish altogether. The old king, demanding love as proof, gives away his kingdom and discovers that affection cannot be measured in words. Betrayed by flattery, stripped of power, he finds truth only in madness. The storm that rages across the heath is the storm within his soul, a tempest of loss, revelation, and fragile rebirth. Through Lear, Shakespeare looked directly into the face of nothingness and did not turn away. The play's bleakness is total, yet within its ruin glimmers the faintest trace of redemption, a recognition that love, though powerless against death, remains the last defense of meaning. "Pray you, undo this button," Lear whispers as life leaves him, and in that small plea lies the full humanity of the man who once commanded the world. To write these tragedies was to strip language to its essence. The words no longer sought beauty, they sought truth, raw and unguarded. Shakespeare, who once delighted in the intricacies of wordplay, now let silence do much of the speaking. His verse lost its youthful symmetry and gained a kind of broken grandeur. The iambic pulse, once steady as the heartbeat of music, began to fracture, mirroring the dissonance of his characters' minds. This was not decay, but evolution. He had learned that poetry must serve feeling, not adorn it. Through the ruin of his meter, he found a new order, a rhythm closer to the erratic breath of grief. Behind the brilliance of these works lay the toll of creation. Each tragedy feels lived rather than imagined, as if drawn from the hidden wounds of its author. We know little of his inner life during these years, but the tone of the writing suggests experience more than observation. Perhaps the loss of his only son, Hamnet, at age 11, had sunk deeper into him than he allowed the world to see. In the silence of that absence, he may have found the vocabulary of loss that no grammar could teach. The death of a child leaves behind a silence that reshapes all other sounds. One writes not to remember, but to survive. The fathers and sons who haunt his later plays speak from that same hollow space. Lear and Cordelia, Hamlet and his ghostly father, even the unspoken grief of Macbeth, all echo a single ache refracted through art. And yet, for all their darkness, the tragedies are not despairing. They are acts of confrontation, not surrender. Shakespeare faces mortality not as enemy but as mirror, a necessary reflection of what gives life its meaning. Macbeth's horror is not that fate is cruel, but that desire itself breeds its own punishment. The witches need not curse him. He curses himself by believing in them. When he finally admits that life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, the words ring with terrifying clarity, and yet through that clarity we feel something close to release. The recognition of emptiness becomes the beginning of acceptance. The playwright, like his characters, had begun to see that the human heart, though fragile, endures precisely because it knows it will break. Night after night, these tragedies unfolded before the crowded playhouse, and still the people came. They came to weep, to tremble, to find in fiction the reflection of their own buried fears. The stage became a church of sorrow, its altar not of stone, but of breath. When Hamlet fell, when Desdemona lay still, when Lear carried Cordelia's body across the stage, the audience stood in reverent silence. They knew they were witnessing not spectacle, but truth. the truth that laughter could not erase, that faith could not simplify. In the moment of tragedy, all differences vanished. The noble and the commoner, the poet and the player were bound together by the same awareness that to be alive is to stand always at the edge of loss. After the performance ended and the crowd dispersed into the night, Shakespeare often lingered alone in the empty theater. The board still held the echo of footsteps. The air still trembled with the ghosts of voices. He would sit in the dim light, his quill set aside, his body weary but his mind awake. The silence that followed tragedy was unlike any other. It was not absence but fullness, as though every emotion had gathered into a single breath. Perhaps in those moments he felt closest to the mystery he spent his life pursuing, the moment when suffering transforms into understanding, when art becomes prayer. The night deepens around him. The river glimmers beyond the open doorway, the current slow, patient, endless. He listens to it and knows that, like the river, the human soul flows on, dark and luminous, shaped by unseen tides. He rises, walks to the edge of the stage, and looks into the darkness where the audience once sat. It is empty now, but he imagines their faces still, the way they leaned forward, caught between dread and wonder. He smiles faintly, a tired, almost grateful smile. For in their silence he has found communion, in their tears, redemption. The tragedies have done their work, as he has done his, yet even he cannot know that centuries later the same words will still move hearts as if newly spoken, that the same shadows will still fall across the page, whispering of what it means to be human. As the years unfolded and the shadows of his tragedies deepened into memory, the man behind them lived within a community of restless, gifted souls whose names would flicker through time beside his own. The London of Shakespeare's maturity was an ecosystem of minds, actors, poets, patrons, printers, and dreamers, each one caught in the delicate economy of words and survival. The theater was their meeting ground, their workshop, their refuge. It was not a solitary art, but a collective act of faith, fragile yet luminous. Within its circle, he found the company that would sustain and challenge him, men like Richard Burbage, John Hemingway, Henry Condell, and the volatile Ben Jonson, each with their own pulse, their own rhythm, each contributing to the strange alchemy that turned breath into meaning. Burbage, the leading actor of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, was more than a performer. He was the living embodiment of Shakespeare's imagination. His voice gave flesh to Hamlet's indecision, to Othello's fury, to Lear's despair. It was said that when Burbage spoke, the crowd fell silent, not from awe but from recognition. Shakespeare wrote for him as one writes for a kindred soul, sculpting words to fit the contours of his breath. Between them, there must have been an unspoken understanding, the quiet bond that exists only between a writer and the body that gives his words life. To watch Burbage act was, for Shakespeare, to see his thoughts walk the earth. They built each other, the actor and the playwright, one shaping the other until their names became inseparable. Then there were Hemingway and Condell, steadfast in temperament, practical men amid the fever of the stage. They handled the business of the company, the ledgers, the permissions, the endless negotiations that kept the playhouse alive. While Shakespeare's head drifted in the clouds of metaphor, theirs remained firmly anchored in coin and schedule. Yet it was their loyalty years later that would secure his immortality. After his death, they would gather his plays into the great First Folio, preserving for the future what time might otherwise have erased. They were not men of poetry, but of devotion. And in their devotion lies one of the quietest acts of love in literary history. And then there was Ben Jonson, rival, companion, mirror, and occasional adversary. Johnson's wit was hard as iron, his mind precise, his pride monumental. He was the craftsman who demanded rules and structure where Shakespeare followed intuition and music. The two men stood at opposite poles of temperament, yet their orbits touched again and again. Johnson criticized, admired, envied, and loved him, though perhaps he never said so directly. They dined together, argued in smoky taverns, and spoke of poetry as if it were a form of theology. Johnson's intellect was architectural, Shakespeare's was elemental, and yet, beneath their differences, there was respect. When Johnson later wrote of him that he was not of an age, but for all time, it was not flattery, but confession. He had seen the magnitude of the other man's gift and bowed grudgingly but sincerely before it. The world they inhabited was rougher than legend remembers. The players lived close to poverty, their fortunes rising and falling with every new decree or outbreak. The theaters were periodically closed by moralists or plague, forcing them to take their performances to the countryside. They rehearsed in cold halls, ate poorly, slept in drafty rooms, and yet, through that hardship, a strange fellowship emerged, a fraternity bound by art and necessity. They were craftsmen in an uncertain trade, yet each carried within him the spark of eternity. Shakespeare, though quieter than most, was their center of gravity. His manner, by many accounts, was gentle, his humor quick, but never cruel. He was not the loudest in the tavern, nor the first to boast of genius. He preferred observation to declaration. Even his rivals admitted a kind of radiance about him, a presence that needed no announcement. In those long nights after rehearsal, they would gather around wooden tables in Bankside's taverns, the air heavy with smoke and laughter. The talk was of plays and politics, of the Queen's health, of rumors from the court, of lines half written and debts half paid. There were quarrels, reconciliations, songs and moments of quiet where one could hear the rain against the shutters. Shakespeare listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried the simplicity of certainty. Perhaps he understood even then that the drama unfolding in those dim-lit rooms was as vital as any he staged. Each jest, each quarrel, each confession would one day find its echo in his characters. The theater of life and the life of theater were the same. Beyond his fellow actors, his circle extended into the world of patrons and nobles, a network of influence and protection that kept his company afloat. The Earl of Southampton had once favored him, perhaps even loved him in some way that defies the categories of friendship. Later came others, courtiers and scholars, who admired his verse. Yet despite his connections, he remained curiously untouched by ambition. He sought neither titles nor privilege. His fame was of a quieter kind, rooted in work rather than display. It is this humility, this steadfast devotion to craft, that lends his legend its human warmth. He did not seek immortality. He labored simply to speak truth in a transient world. Immortality, as always, came unbidden. The globe itself was a kind of living organism that bound them all together. When plague swept the city, they dispersed. When it lifted, they returned as pilgrims to their sanctuary. Each time the curtain rose, the world was remade. The actors trusted his pen, and he trusted their breath. Through that trust, art transcended commerce. It became a shared ritual of survival. The applause that greeted them was not only for performance, but for endurance. The endurance of imagination against the indifference of time. And within this circle of companionship and rivalry, Shakespeare found something rare: continuity. His life, so often shadowed by uncertainty, found stability not in institutions, but in people. The faces that surrounded him, the laughter that filled the evenings, the steady rhythm of rehearsal and performance. All these formed the invisible architecture of his existence. The man who wrote of loneliness was seldom alone. The fellowship of his company anchored him even as his mind roamed through kingdoms and storms. They were his chorus, his witnesses, his reflection. Yet as he aged, he must have sensed the slow shifting of the world around him. New playwrights emerged, new voices clamored for attention. The theater that had once felt eternal was changing shape, its vigor giving way to competition and fatigue. The younger men looked to him with awe, but also as to an elder who belonged to another moment. Perhaps in that recognition lay the first whisper of departure, the realization that the circle of fellowship he had built could not hold forever. But for now, in these middle years, he was surrounded by the music of his own creation, sustained by friendship and by the living communion of his art. Late one evening, as the company dispersed from another performance, he stood alone in the dim courtyard outside the Globe. The torches flickered, casting long shadows on the ground. Somewhere beyond the river, the city murmured. He could still hear laughter fading down the street, Burbage's voice echoing faintly through the fog. For a moment he closed his eyes and listened. The world felt balanced between silence and song, between solitude and fellowship. It was enough, he thought, simply to have lived among such voices, to have spoken through them, to have shared in their fragile miracle of creation. The night air was cool and smelled of rain. He smiled, almost imperceptibly, and walked home through the quiet streets, the sound of the river keeping pace beside him like an old friend. It begins with silence, a silence that moves faster than sound itself, spreading through the streets as doors close and footsteps vanish. London, once so alive with its commerce and laughter, grows still under the weight of invisible fear. The theaters are the first to fall quiet, their stages dark, their benches empty. Notices appear on doors, marking homes where sickness has entered, and the red cross painted on the wood becomes both warning and lament. For Shakespeare, who has lived his life in the pulse of words, the stillness must feel almost unbearable. The plague has returned, and with it the reminder that the breath which gives life to language is also the breath that carries death. The city he knew now belongs to the dead and those waiting to die. He has seen it before, but repetition does not breed ease. Each outbreak brings back the same dread, the empty streets, the smoke from hurried funerals, the faces half hidden behind fear. The playhouses are closed by decree, gatherings forbidden. The laughter, the applause, the communal rhythm of the Globe, gone in an instant. Yet for all its cruelty, the plague has always been his shadow muse, shaping his work in ways even he may not fully understand. The constant awareness of mortality sharpened his art, made him listen more closely to time's fragile heartbeat. He writes now not for performance but for survival, for the need to preserve something of the human voice amid the silence. In his rented lodgings, far from the crowded lanes, he sits by a small window overlooking a deserted street. The smell of burning herbs drifts faintly through the air. People believe that smoke might purify what cannot be seen. Somewhere a bell tolls again, its sound almost too familiar. He dips his quill into ink, not knowing whether what he writes will ever be spoken aloud. The plays that emerge from these months of isolation, Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, Timon of Athens, are restless, ambiguous, their humor darker, their questions sharper. They are not tragedies in the old sense, nor comedies in the old comfort. They are reflections of an uncertain world where virtue and corruption share the same mask, and mercy becomes both hope and illusion. In them, Shakespeare exposes the cracks beneath civility, as if the plague outside had stripped away all pretenses within. He must have walked the empty streets sometimes, listening to the silence as though it, too, were a form of speech. The air would have smelled of smoke and river water, the sounds of the living few and scattered. The city, so recently vibrant, now seemed like one of his own deserted stages after the curtain fell. And yet, in that desolation, he might have found a strange clarity. The understanding that all human gatherings, all applause and ambition are temporary gestures against eternity. What endures is not the noise, but the meaning left behind. In a world so suddenly stripped bare, he learned to see the skeleton of truth beneath the flesh of custom. The plague struck indiscriminately, rich and poor, believer and skeptic, sinner and saint. It mocked the hierarchies of England as it moved through palace and hovel alike. Perhaps that is why, in his later works, we sense an equality of suffering. His kings and clowns now speak with the same despair, the same yearning for grace. Death has made them kin. In Measure for Measure, the Duke disguises himself not to deceive, but to understand, to look upon his city as God might, through pity rather than power. In Timon of Athens, generosity turns to bitterness, echoing the exhaustion of a world that has seen too much betrayal. Through such stories, Shakespeare seems to ask whether humanity can renew itself, or whether every age is doomed to repeat the same fever of greed and folly. And yet, even as the city sickened, nature remained untouched. The river still flowed, the wind still crossed the fields beyond the walls. From his window, he could see clouds drifting above rooftops, indifferent to the misery below. That contrast, the endurance of the world against the frailty of man, haunted him. It would later resurface in King Lear's Storm, in Prospero's Island, in the pastoral forgiveness of his last plays. The plague, by silencing the theaters, forced him into contemplation, and contemplation became creation. Art, for him, was not an escape from death, but a dialogue with it. When at last the sickness waned and the playhouses reopened, the people returned to them with a hunger more desperate than before. They came to laugh, to cry, to be reminded that life still pulsed within them. The first performance after such silence must have felt like resurrection, the sound of voices rising once more into the open air, echoing under the thatched roof, carrying defiance against the memory of loss. Shakespeare stood behind the curtain, listening to the murmur swell, and perhaps felt the strangeness of that miracle, the same breath that once spread, death now restored life through story. Every word spoken on stage became an act of gratitude, but the plague left its mark on him. His writing would never again be untouched by awareness of time's brevity. He had seen how swiftly the world could vanish, how easily the noise of human striving could collapse into quiet. The laughter that returned to the globe was gentler now, tinged with melancholy, as though everyone, from the nobles in the galleries to the apprentices in the pit, understood that joy was only a pause in the inevitable descent of things. And perhaps that understanding was enough. Perhaps it made the joy more real. In the evenings, as the sun set over the river, he would walk through the city slowly, past taverns where voices rose once again, past children playing in the streets, past the markets that smelled of life and earth. He had learned something the plague could not destroy: the endurance of spirit, the persistence of the human need to gather, to tell stories, to find meaning even in ruin. The same mortality that once terrified him had now become his companion. It followed him not as shadow but as reminder that all creation is temporary, and yet, in its brief radiance, divine. As night thickened and the bells ceased, he would return to his room and write a few final lines before extinguishing the candle. The ink shone faintly as it dried, a record of thought and breath, of survival. Beyond the window, the city exhaled its weary calm, alive again but changed. The plague had left scars invisible to the eye, but in the heart of the poet it had planted a deeper faith, not in the permanence of life, but in its wonder. The silence he once feared had become part of his rhythm, the pause between phrases, the breath before revelation. And from that silence, as always, would come the next play, the next vision, the next fragile miracle of words. By the time the plague had loosened its hold and the pulse of London began to steady, Shakespeare found himself at the center of a paradox, revered as an artist, yet bound by the same practical necessities that governed every tradesman. The theater was a living organism of profit and survival, and he had become one of its quiet architects. What had begun as a calling of imagination was now also a venture of business, an enterprise requiring calculation and patience. He had learned that to preserve art, one must also understand its economy. The globe was not sustained by genius alone, but by rent, wages, patronage, and risk. And so, with his fellow shareholders, he navigated the delicate balance between creation and commerce, between the need to feed the spirit and the duty to sustain the body. He was, by nature, a pragmatist, cloaked in poetry. His shares in the company brought him a steady income, enough to secure independence from the fickle tides of patronage, while others squandered their fortunes in taverns or sought favor at court. He saved, invested, and planned. He bought property in Stratford, lending money to neighbors, acquiring land, ensuring his family's future. To some, this seemed worldly for a poet, almost unbecoming of his vocation, but to Shakespeare it was merely another form of order. Art and life were not opposites. They were bound by the same laws of consequence. A theater that could not pay its debts could not perform its miracles, and a poet who did not eat could not write. He understood that imagination thrives best when freed from desperation. His discipline was not that of a mystic, but of a craftsman. He wrote because the company needed new plays, because the audience demanded novelty, because actors required words to live through. Yet within that practicality lay freedom. His art, born within the machinery of performance, grew beyond it. Each line written for the sake of profit became, through his precision, an act of transcendence. He never disdained the crowd that paid their penny at the door. He wrote for them with the same care he gave to princes. Perhaps he saw in their laughter, their tears, the same hunger that drove him, the need to understand themselves through story. London's theatrical world was a marketplace of rivalry. Companies competed for favor, playwrights borrowed and outdid one another, and censorship hovered like a persistent shadow. Shakespeare, whose temperament avoided scandal, maneuvered through it all with quiet intelligence. His gift was not only invention, but adaptability. He gave the people what they desired, but always smuggled something deeper within it. A question, a contradiction, a truth disguised as jest. His contemporaries chased attention. He sought resonance. While others burned brightly and vanished, he learned the art of endurance. Even Ben Jonson, with his thunderous pride, sometimes envied the serene persistence with which Shakespeare's plays returned to the stage, season after season, unaffected by the noise of fashion. As his wealth grew, so did his distance from the precarious world of the actors. He was still of them, but no longer only one of them. The boy from Stratford, once dependent on the approval of patrons, was now a man who owned a share of his own destiny. Yet prosperity did not soften him. It deepened his awareness of the world's contradictions. The same city that rewarded genius could destroy it without warning. He had seen too many friends die poor, too many talents consumed by their own brilliance. Perhaps that is why he remained cautious, never gambling on royal favor, never boasting of his art. He wore success, as he did his costumes, lightly, without illusion that it could last. In quieter moments, he must have contemplated the irony that his greatest creations were born of necessity. He wrote because he must, not because he could. Each play was a response to circumstance, a season's need, an actor's strength, a patron's mood. And yet, through that constant negotiation, he discovered a kind of purity. To make something immortal out of what was momentary, that was the true work. He turned commerce into communion, transforming the ephemeral trade of entertainment into a mirror of the human soul. Beyond the stage, his mind turned increasingly toward Stratford, toward the idea of home. The money he earned went not to indulgence, but to restoration. He purchased the largest house in the town, New Place, its walls strong, its gardens wide. Perhaps he dreamed of the day when the noise of London would recede, when he could walk again by the Avon without the press of expectation. But for now, the city held him still, its appetite insatiable. The Globe needed new plays. The players needed new stories. His quill continued its endless rhythm, tracing the pulse of a world that could not rest. It is strange to think of him at his desk, surrounded by the mundane debris of trade, contracts, receipts, leases, and yet within that same hand, the fate of kings and lovers was being written. The ink that marked business agreements was the same ink that summoned Hamlet's ghost or Juliet's final breath. The sacred and the ordinary flowed from the same source. Perhaps that is why his art endures, because it never denied the world's practical truth, but absorbed it. He did not flee from the marketplace. He redeemed it through meaning. Sometimes, late at night, when the candles burned low and the city outside quieted, he would pause and look at the pile of finished pages beside him. They represented not only his art, but his livelihood, the currency of his existence. He would have thought of the actors who would soon speak these words, of the crowds who would respond, of the coins that would change hands. And beneath that practical awareness, a softer thought must have stirred, the awareness that he was building, word by word, a legacy neither contract nor coin could measure. The line between art and business blurred until it vanished. The exchange of imagination for money, of labor for applause, was not corruption, but connection. The artist and the audience were bound in mutual need, and through that need, something eternal passed between them. The stage, sustained by commerce, became a temple. The marketplace, through him, became sacred ground. When the bells of the city struck midnight, he would rise, stretch his weary hand, and step to the window. The Thames lay still beneath the moon, the faint sound of oars drifting through the dark. Somewhere across the water, the Globe waited, its round silhouette sleeping beneath the stars. He could almost hear the echo of his own words lingering there, trapped in the wood, waiting to awaken again at dawn. The poet smiled, not from pride, but from the quiet satisfaction of one who knows that art, like life, must be earned daily, through patience, through work, through love of the fleeting. He closed the shutters and let the room fall into darkness, the ink drying beside him, another day of creation balanced between necessity and grace. The years passed quietly, and the edges of ambition began to soften like paper left too long in sunlight. The city that had once been the measure of the world to him now seemed a vast echo, its triumphs loud but transient, its promises fading at dusk. He had known the heights of art and the murmur of fame, the applause that rose and vanished into the rafters of the Globe, the faces that lit up at his words and were gone the next season. But there comes a time when even the most tireless imagination seeks stillness, when the noise of creation gives way to the yearning for peace. For William Shakespeare, that stillness called him home, to the slow river, to the quiet fields, to the town that had once been his beginning and would one day be his end. Stratford was no longer the provincial place of his youth. It had become his refuge, a geography of memory rather than exile. When he returned, the air itself felt different. The rhythms of life moved more gently there, as if the world had taken a slower breath. The streets were narrower than he remembered, the timbered houses leaning with age, the smell of wood smoke and hay drifting through the lanes. The river Avon wound through it all like a patient thought, unhurried and unchanging. After years spent in the ceaseless movement of London, the crowds, the noise, the ever-turning wheel of fortune, this stillness must have seemed like a kind of grace. He was no longer the young man who had left in search of life's grandeur. He was a man who had seen it, shaped it, and survived it. Now he sought something simpler. Not applause, but rest. Not creation, but contemplation. At New Place, the house he had purchased years before, he found space enough for both solitude and family. The rooms were large, the gardens broad, filled with fruit trees and the murmur of bees. It was here that he began to live as both landlord and poet, his mornings spent in correspondence and accounts, his afternoons walking the orchard paths, his evenings in quiet conversation. The neighbors greeted him with respect, though perhaps they did not entirely grasp what his name had come to mean beyond the town. To them, he was a man of property, a gentleman who had done well in London, not the author of worlds. And he accepted that modest image without protest. It was enough to belong again among the ordinary rhythms of birth and harvest, enough to feel the weight of seasons passing without the urgency of performance. Yet the city did not wholly release him. News and letters came often, carried by players and patrons still engaged in the trade he had left behind. The Globe continued to prosper, new work still requested, and sometimes he sent them, a scene revised here, a line polished there. But his heart was turning inward. The world he now wrote of was less political, less tragic, more forgiving. His late plays, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, seemed to rise directly from this quieter air, filled with reconciliation rather than struggle, with a gentleness born of distance. The storm, once so central to his art, had at last begun to subside. In the evenings he would walk beside the Avon, listening to its slow conversation with the wind. The river reflected his own passing thoughts, the same water that had once carried his boyhood dreams, now bearing the calm of return. He thought of his son, Hamnet, gone years before, whose absence still lingered in every household shadow. He thought of his daughters, Susanna, steady and intelligent, now married to a respected physician, and Judith, whose laughter reminded him of Anne in their early days. His wife, older now and quiet, kept the rhythms of the home with the same patience she always had. There was affection between them, though it was the affection of endurance rather than passion. Time had weathered them both, worn away the edges of youth, and left behind a companionship built from the shared knowledge of all that had been lost and gained. Sometimes visitors would arrive from London, actors from the old company, friends from the taverns of Bankside, bringing stories of new plays, of changing fashions, of the theater's growing fame. They spoke of how his words were still performed, how his characters continued to breathe before the crowds. He listened with a quiet smile, pleased yet detached. The Globe belonged now to another generation, and he was content to let it go. The applause he heard in his mind was softer now, inward. He no longer sought the immortality of voice. He had already found it. What remained was to live, to walk, to watch the light change upon the river, to listen to the sound of church bells in the distance. And yet, even in retirement, the poet's mind could not entirely rest. The world continued to speak to him in small gestures, the way light fell across a page, the sound of rain on the roof, the laughter of children in the lane. Life itself seemed a play without audience, and he its last quiet observer. Sometimes, perhaps, he would sit by the window and write a few lines not meant for stage or print, lines known only to him. The need to shape thought into language, to order experience into rhythm, never truly left him. But there was no longer any haste, no pressure of deadlines or expectation. Writing had returned to its purest form, a private act of gratitude. He began to sense the circle of his life, closing with a kind of peace. The boy who had once stood by this same river, dreaming of faraway worlds, now stood again in the same place, seeing that the world he sought had always been here, waiting in the quiet of familiar fields. The fame that stretched beyond the horizon of his lifetime could not touch him now. His reward was simpler: the knowledge that he had said what he was born to say, that his words had captured some fragment of truth before vanishing into the vastness of time. The stage was still, but the echo remained, an invisible thread binding Stratford to London, earth to sky, memory to language. At dusk, as the day faded into its long twilight, he would sometimes walk through his garden until the first stars appeared. The air smelled of wet earth and apple blossom, and the sound of the river reached him faintly through the trees. He would pause, listening, as if the wind itself carried the murmurs of his old characters, Hamlet's questioning, Lear's sorrow, Rosalind's laughter, each voice part of a chorus that no silence could entirely still. Perhaps he realized then that the end of creation is not silence, but listening, not departure, but return. He turned back toward the house, the windows warm with candlelight, the evening calm as a closing curtain. Life, like a play well performed, must end, but the meaning remains in the air long after the stage has gone dark. It was in this quiet interval, far from the noise of London, that his imagination turned once more toward the sea as dream and reckoning, as memory and forgiveness. His late plays rise from that tide, as if written by a man who has looked backward through time and found within it not despair but mercy. The tempests that once shattered kingdoms now wash gently over the shores of the human heart, and the shipwrecks that once symbolized ruin become moments of rebirth. Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest are not the works of ambition, but of understanding. They breathe more slowly than his tragedies, their words less burdened by fate, more attuned to the quiet miracle of reconciliation. It is as though he had come to see that what endures in life is not victory but forgiveness, not grandeur but tenderness. The language of these final works is different from the sharp brilliance of his youth. It moves like water, transparent yet profound. The sentences unfold as if spoken by one who has learned the futility of argument and the grace of acceptance. In The Winter's Tale, when Leontes kneels before the statue of the wife he wronged and sees her come to life, the boundary between art and faith dissolves. It is not resurrection he offers us, but the recognition that love can awaken even what time has turned to stone. The same transformation shapes The Tempest, perhaps his most intimate farewell to the world he had created. In Prospero, the magician, the master of illusion who chooses at last to break his staff and set his servants free, we see the poet himself reflected, the maker who, at the height of power, relinquishes it. "Our revels now are ended," Prospero says, and in those words, Shakespeare closes the circle of his life's work. He knows that every performance fades, that even the grandest spell dissolves in air, but he also knows that its echo becomes part of the invisible atmosphere of memory. To those around him, these plays may have seemed strange, neither wholly comic nor wholly tragic, their plots wandering through improbable turns, their tone shifting from sorrow to wonder. But such ambiguity was deliberate. Shakespeare had reached a place beyond the divisions of genre, beyond the need for certainty. He no longer wrote to impress or provoke, he wrote to reconcile. The storms that once terrified him had become metaphors for transformation. What mattered was not how one suffered, but how one forgave, not how one ended, but how one continued. The playwright who had once measured the limits of grief now measured the possibility of peace. In Stratford, the rhythm of his days mirrored the rhythm of his stories. Morning light fell across his desk as he worked, the smell of ink mingling with that of the orchard outside. The seasons turned, the fruit ripened, fell and returned again. He must have felt a deep kinship with that endless cycle. The imagination that had once built kingdoms from words now found its grandeur in the simple persistence of life. In those last years, he wrote as a man no longer struggling to define himself, but to dissolve himself into what he loved: the river, the wind, the faint laughter of grandchildren playing in the garden. He had become both observer and participant, both creator and creation. Sometimes, on clear evenings, he might have walked to the edge of the fields and watched the sun sink beyond the meadows, the clouds aflame, the air trembling with insects. It was the same sky that had covered him as a child, the same horizon he had once imagined as the border of all possible worlds. Now he understood that there was no border, that everything returns, that the end of a journey is simply another beginning. The sea in the tempest is not the sea of peril, but of continuity, the element that joins rather than divides. When Prospero forgives his brother and releases Ariel into the wind, it is Shakespeare forgiving the world for being what it is: beautiful and cruel, fleeting and eternal. He no longer needed applause. He no longer needed the affirmation of others to confirm what he already knew: that the act of creation itself was its own reward. The globe, rebuilt after fire and still echoing with his words, continued without him. Younger writers took the stage, their voices bright but impatient. He bore them no resentment. He had already stepped beyond the need to compete. His gaze had turned inward, toward the mystery that had haunted him since youth: how a man can hold so many lives within him and yet remain only one. In the late romances, he found the answer, not in certainty, but in grace. Each play ends with reunion, with forgiveness that asks nothing in return. The bitterness of earlier years gives way to compassion, as if he had finally made peace with his own creation. The years themselves grew tender, like light filtered through an autumn haze. His hair silvered, his steps slowed, but his mind remained sharp. He would sit sometimes beneath the apple trees, reading old lines aloud to himself, testing their cadence against the silence. The words still lived. They had not left him. They floated in the air like the murmurs of invisible companions, the ghosts of all the voices he had given life. And when he tired, he would close his eyes and listen to the river. It spoke the same language as his art, continuous, unbroken, ever renewed. Perhaps he knew, even then, that he was nearing the end. There is a serenity in his final works that feels like farewell, a tone of release. The magician breaking his wand, the lost child returning home, the statue breathing again. Each image is a gesture of closure. Yet it is not a tragic closure. It is luminous, accepting. The poet who once peered into the abyss of human darkness now looked through it to the light beyond. In that light he saw that love, though mortal, carries the seed of immortality, that words, though transient as breath, can become the air itself. As the days shortened and the evenings deepened into long quiet, he spent more time by the hearth, surrounded by the warmth of home. The laughter of family filled the rooms, soft and distant like music from another world. Sometimes he would tell a story or recall a memory from London, his voice calm, his eyes distant. He spoke without pride, as if his own achievements were things that had happened to someone else long ago. What remained most vivid to him was not fame but fellowship. The faces of friends now gone, the sound of applause mingling with the hum of the river. One night, as the wind swept softly through the orchard, he stepped outside and looked toward the dark line of the horizon. The stars flickered faintly above the roofs of Stratford, the same constellations that had watched over him all his life. He stood there for a long while, neither sad nor content, but aware of the fullness of it all, the noise and silence, the love and loss, the countless words that had passed through him like air through a flute. And as the wind stirred the trees, it seemed to whisper fragments of his own lines back to him, as if the world itself had learned his language. He listened, smiled faintly, and turned back toward the lighted window where his family waited, the warmth of their voices drawing him home. The winter that settled over Stratford in 1616 was mild at first, the kind that promises renewal before revealing its true chill. Shakespeare, now past 50, felt the years more keenly in his bones, though he carried them with the same quiet grace that had marked his life. His days had grown still, his mornings slow, the act of writing now rare and deliberate. He was no longer driven by the urgency of creation, but by the calm necessity of completion. He had said almost everything a man could say. What remained were not words, but gestures, simple acts of putting affairs in order, of acknowledging that every story, even the greatest, must one day find its final line. Yet death, for him, was not the dark terror it had been for Hamlet or Macbeth. It was a companion long known, familiar as the silence that follows applause. He began his will in March, the ink steady, the hand still sure. There is something both tender and practical in those pages, an earthly poetry that mirrors the man himself. His thoughts moved first to family, his daughter Susanna, wise and dutiful, his wife Anne, to whom he left his second-best bed, an inheritance that would puzzle centuries of scholars. But perhaps it was not slight. Perhaps it was intimacy, the bed they had shared, the one closest to the rhythm of breath and dream. For what can one leave to a life partner that is not already shared? Possessions are poor substitutes for memory, and love needs no monument beyond its endurance. He divided the rest with fairness, his language simple, devoid of flourish. He who had shaped kings and conjured storms now spoke only of fields, of houses, of shillings and rings. And yet, even here, one senses the artist's awareness of ritual, the faint echo of performance. The will was a play in miniature, a distribution of roles, a quiet closing of the curtain. Friends and fellow actors were remembered too, small tokens of affection that bridged the distance between Stratford's calm and London's roar. To Heminges and Condell, to Burbage, he left mementos, gestures of gratitude toward those who had carried his words to life. They would repay him after his death in kind, gathering the scattered scripts, preserving them in the first folio, ensuring that the voice of their friend would not vanish with his breath. There is dignity in that circle, that unspoken exchange between creation and remembrance. Even as he wrote his will, he was surrounded by invisible company, the faces of the countless souls he had imagined, the echoes of voices that had never existed before his pen gave them breath. He must have known they would outlive him, that they had already become their own lineage. The man would die, but the language would go on speaking, as if animated by some quiet promise he himself had never made aloud. In those final months, his body weakened, but his mind remained bright. He walked the gardens of New Place when the weather allowed, leaning on a stick, pausing often to watch the slow drift of clouds above the rooftops. He had always written of time as thief and healer, but now he felt its hand gently rather than cruelly. There is a stillness in those last days, a sense of reconciliation between the poet and the life he had observed so long. The world no longer demanded that he explain it. It simply existed, and that was enough. Birds sang in the orchard, the Avon moved as it always had, and the church bells marked the hours with indifferent regularity. For a man who had given the world its greatest words, silence had become his final companion, and he received it with gratitude. There is a legend, perhaps true, perhaps not, that he shared a final evening of merriment with his old friends Johnson and Drayton. That laughter filled the house and wine and reminiscence of youth. If so, it is a fitting end. The poet of every emotion bidding farewell, not in solemnity, but in fellowship, surrounded by the same humanity that had nourished his art. The next day he took to his bed. No drama marked his passing, no final speeches, no oracles. Death came as it comes to all, quietly and without spectacle. On April 23rd, the day that would one day also mark his birth, William Shakespeare left the world as he had lived in it, gracefully, with the humility of one who knew that the play continues after the actor exits. He was buried 2 days later in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church, where he had once been baptized. The stone above his grave bears an epitaph, said to be of his own making, simple and haunting. "Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." It is both jest and warning, a final touch of wit guarding his rest. The church stands by the Avon still, its spire mirrored in the quiet water. Inside, the air smells faintly of stone and candle wax, and the light from the stained glass falls gently on the slab that bears his name. Visitors step softly there, not out of superstition but reverence, aware that beneath their feet lies the dust of a man whose imagination reshaped the world. But if one listens closely, the silence of that place is not complete. It carries an undertone, the low, unending murmur of the river just beyond the walls, the same river that flowed beside his cradle and his youth, that witnessed his return, that now whispers past his grave. Its voice is timeless, indifferent, eternal, and in its current one can almost hear the cadence of his verse, the rise and fall of lines that still breathe centuries after his death. Time, which he once feared, had at last made peace with him. The circle was closed. The boy from Stratford, the actor of London, the poet of the world, now lay at rest where he had begun, and yet the world refused to let him sleep entirely. His words continued to awaken wherever they were spoken, in places he could never have imagined, in courts and taverns, in schools and on distant shores. His ghost did not haunt, it illuminated. Through him, the English language found its full capacity for emotion, for contradiction, for grace. Death had taken the man, but not the motion of his thought. His characters lived on, endlessly reenacting the mysteries of love, power, guilt, and mercy. Perhaps he would have smiled at this, for he had always known that words, once freed into the air, belong not to their author, but to time. Evening gathers now over Stratford, the river dark beneath the willows, the church silent except for the faint drip of water from its eaves. Somewhere far away, an actor recites his lines, unaware that in doing so, he keeps alive the voice of a man who understood the soul more deeply than any who came before or after. The centuries contract in that moment, and the listener feels again the pulse of the 16th century, the breath of a poet who saw the world entire and forgave it. In the hush that follows, the boundary between life and art dissolves, and what remains is neither legend nor ghost, but the enduring whisper of humanity itself, speaking softly, endlessly through his words. When the curtain falls for the last time, the world seldom knows how to listen. The silence that follows a life like Shakespeare's is not the silence of absence, but of absorption, as if the earth itself must take a long breath to hold what has been given to it. In the years after his death, the river kept flowing past the churchyard, untroubled by fame or mourning. The people of Stratford went on with their days, tending shops, ringing the church bell, crossing the same narrow bridge over the Avon where he had once walked. The theater, ever restless, continued its rhythm of openings and closures, its actors repeating the gestures he had written, not realizing that they were breathing immortality into his name. London, that vast and forgetful city, did not stop for the poet's passing, but his words, small black marks on fragile paper, had already begun to drift outward, like seeds on the wind, finding soil in the minds of those who loved language and life. At first, he was remembered by his circle, the companions who had shared his laughter and his labors. It was John Heminges and Henry Condell who ensured that the poet's voice did not vanish with the noise of the tavern. They gathered his scattered manuscripts, pieced together scenes from memory, corrected errors of copying and performance, and in 1623, 7 years after his death, they offered the world the first folio. It was a heavy book, taller than the width of a man's chest, its pages dense with type, its weight both literal and sacred. Without it, more than half his plays would have been lost forever. No Macbeth, no Julius Caesar, no The Tempest, no Twelfth Night. The folio preserved not only his art, but the heartbeat of a civilization. Hemingway and Condell could not have known that their work would become one of the most precious artifacts in human history. They acted out of friendship and faith, out of love for the man who had given them words to live by. In doing so, they extended his life far beyond the reach of his own body. Yet even with the folio printed, there was no instant canonization. The 17th century, distracted by its own wars and revolutions, had little time for reverence. The playhouses were closed again during the Puritan rule, their stages silenced, their wooden boards rotting beneath neglect. For a while, it seemed as if his voice, like so many before it, might fade into the dust of forgotten ages. But silence, as it had, in his lifetime, proved to be only a pause before renewal. When the theaters reopened after the Restoration, his plays returned, altered by new fashions but alive. Actors spoke his lines once more, though often with flourishes and cuts that would have startled their creator. The words adapted, as living things do, reshaping themselves to new ears, new centuries. His genius was that it could withstand distortion. However they were spoken, his truths endured. Over time, admiration turned to awe. Critics began to see in him something beyond artistry, a kind of natural law of the human soul. Dryden called him the man who of all modern and perhaps ancient poets had the largest and most comprehensive soul. Johnson, more than a century later, wrote that his works are a map of life. They were right, though perhaps not in the way they intended. Shakespeare did not capture life through philosophy, but through empathy. He understood that to portray the world truly, one must love it in all its contradictions. His plays were not arguments, but acts of recognition. And because recognition never grows old, neither did he. As his fame spread, so did the mystery. The man himself, so plain in the records of Stratford, became the subject of endless speculation. Could one life contain such knowledge, such language, such vision? Doubt became its own form of tribute, a measure of how impossible his achievement seemed. Some imagined that noblemen had written under his name. Others claimed he was a myth entirely. But the myth only deepened the miracle. The absence of proof made the presence of his voice more wondrous. It was as if the universe itself had chosen one quiet man to speak on its behalf, and then erased all traces of explanation. The plays remained, the rest dissolved into mist. In every generation since, actors have sought him as pilgrims seek a shrine. They have stood upon countless stages, stone amphitheaters, candlelit halls, great theaters of marble and velvet, and spoken the same words he once shaped by candlelight. They have changed costumes, accents, centuries, but not the pulse that drives the lines. A modern Hamlet, standing under electric light, still feels the same vertigo of thought as the Elizabethan prince. A Lear in some far-off land still kneels in the same storm. His stories have crossed oceans, languages, and empires. They have been whispered in trenches, recited in prisons, danced to music, painted into silence. His art became the common property of humanity, owned by none, belonging to all. And yet, for all the grandness of his reach, there remains something intimate in his survival. To read him is to feel as though he is near, listening, smiling slightly at our astonishment. The voice that once wrote of kings and clowns now speaks to each reader as if to one confidant. He left no diary, no treatise, no declaration of intent. He left only what he wrote, and in that writing we find ourselves reflected. When we quote his words, we do not repeat him, we join him. His language has so entered our own that we can no longer tell where his thought ends and ours begins. There is a kind of irony in how immortality found him. He did not chase it, yet it pursued him. His bones rest in the quiet church by the Avon, and above them the light of afternoon still falls through the stained glass as it did on the day he was buried. Outside, the town remains small, its streets little changed, the air filled with the same sense of water and earth. Pilgrims come and go, leaving flowers, taking photographs, reading aloud from their favorite passages before falling silent. The silence is not of mourning, but of awe. They stand where he once stood, and through that stillness they seem to hear something. A faint murmur of words carried on the river wind, the echo of lines that have not ceased to speak since the day they were first uttered. In that continuity lies the measure of his triumph. He conquered not through empire, but through empathy, not through conquest, but through connection. His legacy is not a monument of marble, but a living current in the mind. Every time his words are spoken, they are reborn. Every time they are read, they awaken something that had been sleeping in us. Perhaps this is what he meant to achieve all along, not glory, but communion, the endless conversation between voice and listener, between writer and world. The curtain falls, yes, but the play continues in the breath of those who remember. Even now, if one stands on the banks of the Avon at twilight, the air still hums with presence. The river glides beneath the willows, catching the colors of the dying sun, and the bells of Holy Trinity drift across the water. Somewhere, a line from his verse seems to rise and vanish again, a question, a confession, a prayer. It is impossible to tell whether it comes from the world or from within. That is his gift, that centuries later, we cannot distinguish his words from our own thoughts. The play is over, but its echo remains, as eternal as the flow of the river that watched his life begin and end. The centuries passed as softly as pages turning, and still his words did not fade. Empires rose and fell, the language itself shifted, the stage changed from wood to marble to electric light, yet somewhere in every age a voice was speaking his lines as though newly written. The 18th century, formal and balanced, claimed him as philosopher. The 19th, fevered and romantic, made of him a prophet. Each generation, needing a mirror, found one in his works, for he had written not of his own time, but of the essence that runs through all time. The world remade him endlessly, as if his plays were living creatures that evolved to survive every age that tried to contain them. His England became everyone's England, his men and women our own shadows and desires. The small island of his birth could no longer hold him. He had entered the boundless territory of memory. In London, statues rose to honor him. Theaters bore his name. Scholars began the long labor of interpretation, each insisting they had found his true intent. Libraries filled with commentaries, each trying to explain the mystery of how one man could contain so much of humanity. Yet the more they studied, the more elusive he became. His genius resisted captivity. Every attempt to define him dissolved into ambiguity, for he had been too wise to leave the shape of his soul fixed in one form. His plays do not tell us who he was. They tell us who we are when we read them. In this way, he remains the most intimate of strangers, a presence that meets us anew each time we return to his words. The Victorians made him moral. The moderns made him ambiguous. The postmoderns made him infinite. He was and is all of these things because he belongs to none. His power lies in the spaces between certainty and doubt. When the world seeks order, it finds comfort in his justice. When it seeks rebellion, it finds shelter in his irony. His characters move as we do, caught between impulse and reflection, between love and betrayal, between the wish for meaning and the knowledge of its fragility. Hamlet's hesitation, Lear's blindness, Desdemona's faith, Rosalind's laughter, these are not relics but living forces, flowing through every age that speaks his name. They have become part of our emotional vocabulary, the lens through which we understand ourselves. There are nights, even now, when his plays are performed under open skies, the stars above echoing those that once looked down on the globe. The audience sits wrapped in the darkness, faces lifted, listening to the same words spoken 4 centuries ago, and something ancient stirs within them. It is not nostalgia, but recognition. The cadence of his language touches a rhythm older than history, the rhythm of breathing, of thought, of the heart remembering its own patterns. In those moments, time collapses. The actors on stage are no longer actors, the audience no longer an audience. They are all participants in the same ceremony, the same act of remembrance that began the day he first set ink to paper. Every performance becomes a resurrection, not of the man, but of the mystery he uncovered. That through art we are most alive, and in being alive we are most transient. Across continents his words took root. In Germany, Goethe called him divine and found in Hamlet the reflection of modern doubt. In France, Hugo saw in him the sublime irregularity of nature itself. In Russia, Tolstoy denounced him while Dostoevsky revered him, proof that his reach could not be contained by praise or dismissal. In the new worlds across the ocean, his plays traveled with settlers and ships, performed in rough taverns and mining camps, their verses echoing in accents that would have astonished their author. The universality of his voice transcended borders, faiths, and classes. He belonged to everyone because he wrote of everything. Even war could not silence him. In the trenches of the 20th century, soldiers carried small editions of his works, reciting Henry V before battle, finding in his lines not patriotism but courage, an echo of shared humanity amid chaos. When bombs fell on London, the globe long vanished. Fragments of his verse were still spoken in the shelters below. In exile and captivity, his words became a form of freedom, proof that thought could not be imprisoned. He had written once that, "The web of our life is of a mingled yarn, good and ill together." It is a truth that history has confirmed again and again, and each time his voice has been there to articulate what the living could not. But beyond monuments and analysis, there remains something more subtle, his influence on the hidden corners of everyday speech. The English tongue itself bends toward him. Our idioms are his. Phrases once his invention have become so natural that we forget their origin. He speaks through us when we describe jealousy as a green-eyed monster, when we talk of what is foregone, or when we call something a sorry sight. His words have merged with our consciousness, as inseparable from our thought as the air from our breath. That is perhaps the highest form of remembrance, to live within language itself, unseen but omnipresent. And yet, to say that the world remembers him is to misunderstand what remembrance is. It is not an act of will, but of inevitability. We remember him because he understood us before we understood ourselves. His insight was not prediction, but recognition, an awareness that all human beings, no matter their century, share the same fragile longings, the need to love, to be seen, to endure, to forgive. These longings renew his life each time they are felt anew. The world does not carry his memory, it lives within it. Every time we fall in love, doubt our choices, lose faith, or find it again, we step into the rhythm of his imagination. There's a quiet evening somewhere, a rehearsal room in Tokyo, a classroom in Nairobi, a park in Buenos Aires, where an actor speaks his lines for the first time, uncertain, trembling, feeling the words come alive in their mouth. At that moment, across distance and centuries, Shakespeare breathes again, not as ghost or monument, but as living pulse, as voice reborn through other voices. This is how the world remembers, not by repetition, but by renewal. His work remains unfinished because life remains unfinished, and each generation writes its own meaning into his words. If he could stand among us now, he might smile to see how his plays have multiplied beyond imagination, translated into every language, adapted to every stage, played by men, by women, by children, by machines. He would recognize perhaps the same pattern he once saw in the theater of his own time, the endless circle of illusion and truth, of performance and reflection. The globe he built was only wood and plaster. The globe that carries his memory is the world itself. And somewhere, always, his characters speak, their voices overlapping like waves, a whisper from Juliet's balcony, a king's cry in the storm, a fool's laughter under the stars. They are endless, like the river that never ceases to flow past the place where his bones lie sleeping. And now the story circles back to where it began, to the breath before speech, to the hush before the first quill touched paper. Time, which once scattered him across the centuries, gathers him again into a single silence, not of death, but of endurance. For there is a silence that ends things, and another that preserves them, a stillness that does not erase but deepens. William Shakespeare belongs to that latter kind, a silence alive with echoes. It is not emptiness that surrounds his name, but resonance, the faint vibration of words that have never quite stopped speaking. To listen for him is to listen to the spaces between words, to the pause in every soliloquy, to the heartbeat beneath every line. What remains after so much language is not noise but understanding, the awareness that life itself is the brief sound made between two eternities of quiet. In that silence lives the secret of his immortality. The plays endure not because they are perfect, but because they are incomplete, because they leave room for every generation to enter, to breathe, to change. His characters never conclude, they continue. Hamlet's question remains unanswered, Lear's grief unmeasured, Prospero's farewell still unfinished. They live because they remain open, because Shakespeare, wiser than any philosopher, knew that the human spirit is not solved, but witnessed. To capture life, he did not attempt to define it. He simply held up a mirror and let the reflection shift with every passing light. That is why we still find ourselves there. Why, when we read his lines aloud, we feel not that we are visiting the past, but that the past is visiting us. Perhaps that is what he intended all along, to create something that would never fully end, to write not a monument, but a mirror that would outlast both him and the world that bore him. In that sense, he did not die. His bones may rest beneath stone, his quill long turned to dust, but the gesture of his imagination continues in every act of creation that follows. A poet writing by candlelight, a child reciting a line from memory, an actor standing trembling before an audience, all are continuations of that first impulse he felt in the cramped room above the London tavern, when he believed, for reasons even he could not name, that words could capture the movement of the soul. He had no need of immortality. The language itself became his body, his afterlife, his unending performance. If one could speak to him now, across the centuries of applause and scholarship and myth, what would one say? Perhaps nothing at all. For what reply could match the magnitude of what he gave? Better to stand in quiet recognition, as one does before the sea, aware that its depth cannot be measured, only felt. To honor him is not to explain him, but to listen. To sit in the theater as the lights fade, to hear the first line spoken, and to feel, for an instant, that the distance between now and then has disappeared. He taught us that art is not escape, but encounter, that through fiction we return to ourselves, changed but familiar. The audience that once stood in the pit of the globe still stands, only scattered now across the surface of the earth, still waiting, still listening for that first word. And yet the truest remembrance of him may be found not in theaters or libraries, but in the quiet moments of ordinary life, in the lover's hesitation before confession, in the weary parent's forgiveness, in the laughter shared after grief. These are the places where his words continue, unspoken yet alive. He taught us that humanity is a performance without end, that we are all both actor and spectator in the play of existence. The world has changed beyond recognition, yet the heartbeat beneath it remains the same. He is present not as figure, but as feeling, not as author, but as atmosphere. The cadence of his thought moves through the world like wind through leaves, unseen but unmistakable. Sometimes, if one stands by the river Avon in the fading light, the water catches the sky in a way that seems to breathe. The church spire rises at its edge, and the air holds that peculiar stillness that belongs only to dusk. It is easy then to imagine him nearby, not as ghost or statue, but as presence, folded into the air, watching the reflection ripple. The same wind that once filled the sails of ships carrying his words to distant lands moves through the trees, whispering fragments of lines that seem to belong as much to nature as to speech. The silence there is not absence, but communion. The same silence that begins every act of imagination, the same stillness that follows every final line. It is the silence he wrote toward all his life, the silence that holds the world after the curtain falls. And so the story ends as it must, not with finality, but with continuation. His voice does not conclude, it dissolves into ours. The curtain has fallen, but the breath that carried his words still moves through time, invisible yet eternal. Somewhere, always, someone begins to speak, and the story begins again. For as long as there are hearts capable of wonder, as long as there is language to hold the shape of thought, the spirit of Shakespeare endures, not as memory but as motion. His legacy is not the words he wrote, but the silence they awaken in us, the pause in which we remember that to be human is to imagine, and to imagine is to live beyond ourselves.